Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Sierra Nevada mountains, near the abandoned logging town of Calpin, California. The plan had seemed perfect when Sarah Rodriguez first suggested it 3 months ago. A weekend backpacking trip through the Tahoe National Forest, just the four of us from the marketing firm where we'd been grinding away for the past 2 years. Sarah, our perpetually optimistic team leader with her infectious laugh and boundless energy. Mark Clark, the quiet IT specialist who knew more about wilderness survival than anyone gave him credit for. Michael Williams, my younger brother by 3 years, whose easy charm masked a deep need to prove himself after losing his job 6 months prior. And me, desperately needing to escape the suffocating routine of deadlines and conference calls that had begun to feel like a slow strangulation. We'd chosen the Calpine area specifically because it was off the beaten path. No crowded campgrounds, no cell towers, no distractions. Just endless miles of towering pines, granite outcroppings, and crystalline streams that promised the kind of cleansing solitude our city-frayed nerves craved. The old logging roads that crisscrossed the region had been abandoned for decades, leaving behind a network of trails that few hikers bothered to explore. The first sign something was wrong came before we even reached the trailhead. Our GPS started glitching about 20 miles outside of Truckee, the screen flickering between our current location and somewhere deep in the Nevada desert. Mark tried recalibrating it twice before giving up with a frustrated grunt. "Technology," he muttered, pulling out a worn paper map from his glove compartment. "This is why I always carry backup." But when he spread the map across the hood of his Jeep, even Sarah's eternal optimism wavered. The roads on the map didn't match what we could see around us. According to the cartography, we should have been standing in the middle of a lake. "Maps get updated all the time," Michael said, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Maybe they rerouted some roads after this was printed." I remember the way the wind moved through the trees at that moment. Not the usual gentle rustle, but something that sounded almost like whispering. Like voices having a conversation just beyond the range of human hearing. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since we'd left Truckee, and the afternoon sun seemed strangely muted, as if filtered through layers of gauze. We pressed on, following a dirt road that seemed to match the general direction we needed to go. The landscape grew increasingly desolate. What should have been thriving forest showed signs of some old blight. Dead trees standing like skeletal sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the sky in supplication. The few living pines that remained seemed stunted, their needles a sickly yellow-brown that made them look perpetually dying. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested as we passed the rusted remains of what had once been a logging truck, now more rust than metal. "Find a different area." "Come on, Jen," Sarah said, though I caught her glancing nervously at the abandoned machinery. "We drove all this way. Besides, look at those peaks." She pointed toward the mountains rising before us, their snow-capped summits gleaming despite the overcast sky. "It's going to be incredible." Michael nodded eagerly. Ever since losing his job, he'd been desperate to prove he wasn't falling behind, wasn't becoming a burden. This trip represented something important to him. A chance to show he could still contribute, still lead. "Sarah's right," he said. "A little adventure never hurt anyone." Mark said nothing, but I noticed his knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel. We finally found what passed for a parking area near an old Forest Service sign so weathered and bullet-riddled that only fragments of text remained visible. "Danger," and "not responsible." The rest had been obliterated by time and target practice. As we shouldered our packs, the silence felt oppressive. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing of insects. Just the whisper of wind through dead branches and the crunch of our boots on pine needles that had been accumulating for what looked like years without decomposing properly. The trail itself was barely visible, more of a suggestion carved into the landscape by decades of disuse. Ancient blazes on tree trunks provided the only indication we were following an actual path rather than wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. "How far to the first campsite?" I asked, consulting the hand-drawn map Mark had copied from some obscure hiking forum. "According to this, about 6 miles," he replied, but his brow was furrowed as he studied the terrain around us. Though I'm not sure this map is entirely accurate either. We hiked in relative quiet for the first hour, each lost in our own thoughts. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, the canopy above so thick that even in the middle of the afternoon, we found ourselves walking in perpetual twilight. The temperature continued to drop, and I pulled on an extra layer despite having planned for much warmer weather. It was Sarah who first noticed the smell. "Do you guys smell that?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. We all stopped and inhaled. There it was, a sickly, sweet odor, like fruit left too long in the sun, undercut with something metallic and nauseating. "Probably a dead animal," Michael said, though he looked uncomfortable. "Maybe a deer that didn't make it through last winter." But the smell didn't fade as we continued hiking. If anything, it grew stronger, clinging to our clothes and seeming to coat the inside of our nostrils. Mark started breathing through his mouth, and I saw Sarah discreetly cover her nose with her sleeve. The first truly unsettling incident happened around mile 3. We'd stopped for a water break near what appeared to be an old hunting blind, a ramshackle wooden structure built into the crook of a massive pine tree. As Mark studied his map and Sarah rummaged through her pack for energy bars, I found myself staring at the blind. Something was wrong with it. The wood was weathered and gray, obviously decades old, but there were scratches in the planks that looked fresh. Deep gouges that started about 7 feet off the ground and dragged downward, as if something with very large claws had been trying to get inside, or get out. "Guys," I said, pointing toward the structure, "look at this." Michael followed my gaze and his face went pale. What the hell could make marks like that? "Bear, maybe," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. The scratches were too uniform, too deliberate. They looked almost like claw marks, but no bear I knew of had claws that long or that precise. Mark was studying the marks with the intensity he usually reserved for troubleshooting server problems. "The wood's old," he said finally, "but these scratches, they can't be more than a few days old. You can still see fresh splinters." As if summoned by his observation, a sound drifted down from inside the blind, a soft scraping like fingernails dragging across wood. We all froze, listening. The sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic. Scrape, scrape, scrape. "There's something in there," Michael whispered. The scraping stopped. For a long moment we stood in perfect silence, staring up at the dark opening of the blind. Then, slowly, impossibly, something pale appeared in the shadowed doorway. It might have been a face, though it was too far away and too obscured to be certain. But I felt it watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We need to go," I said. "Now." None of us argued. We shouldered our packs and resumed hiking with a pace that bordered on frantic. Behind us, I could swear I heard the sound of something large moving through the trees, keeping pace with us but staying just out of sight. The trail began to climb more steeply, winding through a series of switchbacks that offered occasional glimpses of the valley below. What I saw during those brief overlooks made my unease deepen into genuine fear. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, an unbroken canopy of sickly trees and gathering shadows. But it was the patterns that disturbed me most. Perfect circles of dead trees scattered throughout the landscape like enormous crop circles, as if something had systematically killed the vegetation in precise geometric formations. "Mark," I called ahead to where he was setting the pace. "Are you seeing this?" He followed my pointing finger and stopped so abruptly that Sarah nearly collided with him. Below us, the circles were even more pronounced from this elevation, some of them hundreds of yards across. At the center of each dead zone, something dark was visible, though the distance made it impossible to determine what. "I've never seen anything like that," he said quietly. "It's not natural. Disease doesn't spread in perfect circles." "Maybe it's some kind of geological thing," Sarah suggested, but she sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as us. "Mineral deposits that are toxic to plant life." Michael had gone completely silent, his face pale as he stared down at the unnatural patterns. I recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd worn the day he was laid off, a mixture of fear and the dawning realization that the world wasn't as predictable or safe as he'd believed. We pressed on as the afternoon light began to fade. Though fade wasn't quite accurate. The light didn't gradually dim so much as it seemed to be absorbed by the forest itself, as if the trees were drinking it in and refusing to let it go. By what should have been late afternoon, we were hiking through an oppressive dusk that made it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. That's when we encountered the Hendersons. They appeared on the trail ahead of us so suddenly it was as if they'd materialized from the shadows themselves. An elderly couple, probably in their 70s, walking toward us with the slow, measured pace of experienced hikers. The woman wore a faded red jacket and carried a walking stick carved with intricate designs. The man was tall and lean, with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes that seemed to reflect what little light remained. "Evening, folks," the man called out when we were still 20 yards apart. His voice carried oddly in the dense air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're a bit far from the main trails, aren't you?" "We're looking for the old logging camp," Sarah replied, her natural friendliness overriding the tension we'd all been feeling. "There's supposed to be a good camping spot near the ruins." The woman made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. "Oh, you don't want to go there, dear. Not at this time of year." "Why not?" Michael asked, and I heard the challenge in his voice. He'd been growing increasingly defensive all day, interpreting every obstacle as a personal affront. The man and woman exchanged a look that lasted several seconds too long. When the man spoke again, his tone had changed subtly, becoming more urgent. "The old camp. There's been trouble there recently. People going missing. The Forest Service has it cordoned off, though I suppose the signs might have blown down by now." "What kind of trouble?" Mark asked, and I was grateful that someone was asking the practical questions. "The kind you don't want to encounter after dark," the woman replied. She was studying us with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, her gaze lingering on each of our faces as if memorizing them. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles back the way you came. You could camp there tonight, head out in the morning." But even as she spoke, I could see the shadows deepening around us. 2 miles back would put us hiking in complete darkness, and something about these strangers was setting off every alarm bell in my head. The way they'd appeared so suddenly. The way their voices carried. The way they seemed to know exactly where we were going despite the isolation of this area. "We appreciate the warning," I said carefully, "but we're pretty well prepared. We'll be fine." The woman's expression shifted then, and for just a moment I could have sworn her eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Will you, dear? Will you really?" They moved past us then, continuing down the trail with that same measured pace. But as they disappeared into the gloom behind us, I heard the woman say something to her companion that made my blood run cold. Such a shame. They seemed like nice young people. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to the others once the couple was out of sight. "Hear what?" Sarah asked. I looked at each of them in turn, but their expressions were blank. Either they genuinely hadn't heard the woman's comment, or something was preventing them from remembering it. We found the logging camp just as full darkness fell. The ruins were more extensive than we'd expected. The remains of several large buildings scattered across a clearing that must have housed dozens of workers in its heyday. Concrete foundations poked through decades of accumulated pine needles, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a massive sawmill dominated the center of the site. Rusted machinery lay scattered around like the bones of prehistoric creatures, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But it was the trees that surrounded the clearing that made us all stop and stare. They formed a perfect circle around the ruins, their trunks standing as straight and uniform as fence posts. These trees were different from the diseased specimens we'd been passing all day, ancient pines that must have been growing for centuries, their massive trunks easily 6 feet in diameter. But despite their impressive size, something was fundamentally wrong with them. Their bark was pale, almost white in the darkness, and their branches grew in unnatural patterns, twisted and gnarled into shapes that suggested reaching arms or grasping claws. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah said, her usual enthusiasm notably absent. Mark was already setting up his tent near what had once been the main building's foundation. "It's just old ruins," he said, but I noticed he kept glancing toward the tree line as he worked. "Lots of history in these mountains. We're probably not the first people to camp here." As we established our campsite, using our headlamps and flashlights to navigate the uneven ground, I began to notice details that hadn't been visible in the fading daylight. The concrete foundations were covered with symbols, not graffiti or random markings, but deliberate carvings that looked like they'd been made with considerable skill and effort. Spirals and angular designs that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering beam of my flashlight. "Check this out," Michael called from near the sawmill ruins. We gathered around him as he illuminated a section of rusted metal with his light. More symbols were carved here, but these looked different, fresher somehow, as if they'd been made recently. "What do you think they mean?" Sarah asked. Mark was studying them with the same intensity he'd shown at the hunting blind. "I don't know, but look at this." He moved his light along the metal, revealing that the symbols formed a continuous pattern that wrapped around the entire structure. Someone spent a lot of time on this. These aren't random scratches. As we finished setting up camp, the temperature continued to plummet. My breath was visible in white puffs, and frost was already beginning to form on our gear despite the fact that it was supposed to be late spring. The cold seemed to seep up from the ground itself, penetrating our sleeping bags and clothes with a chill that no amount of layering could ward off. We gathered around our camp stove to heat some food, huddling close to its meager warmth. The silence of the forest was absolute now. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing but the soft hiss of our stove and the occasional crack of settling metal from the old machinery. "So," Sarah said, clearly trying to lighten the mood, "anyone have any good ghost stories?" "I don't think we need ghost stories tonight," I replied, but I was only half joking. The atmosphere of this place was oppressive enough without adding fictional terrors to the mix. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound of pure agony that seemed to go on forever before cutting off abruptly. We all froze, our spoons halfway to our mouths, staring at each other in the dim light of our headlamps. "What the hell was that?" Michael whispered. Before anyone could answer, the scream came again, closer this time and definitely human. But there was something wrong with it, something that made it sound almost mechanical, as if it were being produced by something that was only imitating human vocal cords. Mark was already on his feet, reaching for the bear spray we'd packed as a precaution. "Should we check it out?" "Are you insane?" I hissed. "We stay right here, together." But even as I spoke, I could see Michael's face in the lamplight, set with the stubborn determination that had gotten him into trouble his entire life. He was already grabbing his flashlight and standing up. "Someone might be hurt," he said. "We can't just ignore it." "Michael, no," I said, grabbing his arm. "This feels wrong. All of it. The couple on the trail, this place, those sounds. We need to stay together." The scream came again, and this time it was definitely closer. Close enough that we could hear it echoing off the surrounding trees, bouncing back and forth until it seemed to come from every direction at once. "It's moving," Sarah said in a small voice. "Whatever's making that sound, it's moving toward us." We huddled closer to our small circle of light, peering out into the absolute darkness that surrounded our camp. The trees that ringed the clearing were invisible now, but I could feel them there, standing like silent watchers. waiting. That's when our lights started going out. It began with Sarah's headlamp, which flickered once and then died completely. She smacked it with her palm, but nothing happened. "The battery was full when we started," she said, a note of panic creeping into her voice. Then Mark's flashlight began to dim, its bright beam fading to a weak yellow glow that barely illuminated a few feet in front of him. He checked the battery compartment, but everything seemed fine. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "These are brand new batteries." One by one, our lights failed or began to fail, leaving us with only the weak flame of our camp stove and my dying headlamp to hold back the darkness. And in that growing darkness, shapes began to move. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, tricks of light and shadow playing on my overstressed mind. But gradually, I began to make out forms moving between the trees. Tall, pale figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. They stayed just at the edge of visibility, never quite solid enough to be certain they were really there. "Do you see them?" I whispered to the others. "See what?" Michael asked, but his voice was tight with fear. I pointed toward the tree line, but even as I did, the figures seemed to melt back into the shadows. I thought I saw... The scream came again, much closer now. Close enough that we could hear it wasn't just one voice, but many voices screaming in unison, creating a horrible harmony of agony that seemed to resonate in our bones. "We need to leave," I said, standing up and starting to pack my gear. "Right now. We hike out in the dark." "That's crazy," Michael protested. "We can't navigate these trails in the dark with dying flashlights." "We can't stay here," I shot back. "Something is very wrong with this place." But before we could make a decision, the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise had been, pressing down on us like a physical weight. In that silence, I could hear something new, the sound of footsteps moving through the forest, slow and deliberate, coming from multiple directions. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh. "They're surrounding us," she whispered. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by other sounds, the crack of breaking branches, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. My headlamp chose that moment to die completely, plunging us into darkness broken only by the tiny flame of our camp stove. In that flickering orange light, the ruins around us seemed to take on new and sinister shapes, the shadows dancing in ways that suggested movement where there should be none. "The stove," Mark said urgently. "We need to keep the stove lit." But even as he spoke, the flame began to sputter and change color, shifting from orange to an unnatural blue-green that cast everything in a sickly, underwater glow. The symbols carved into the concrete foundations seemed to pulse in this strange light, as if they were responding to some unseen energy. That's when we saw him. The figure emerged from between two of the pale trees at the edge of the clearing, walking with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. At first, I thought it was the old man we'd encountered on the trail, but as he drew closer, I realized this was something else entirely. He was tall and gaunt, wearing what looked like the remnants of old logging clothes that hung in tatters from his skeletal frame. His skin was the same pale white as the bark of the surrounding trees, and his eyes reflected our dying stove light like mirrors. But it was his smile that made my blood freeze. A wide, predatory grin that revealed far too many teeth, all of them sharp and stained with something dark. "Welcome," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through dead branches. "We've been waiting for you." Behind him, other figures began to emerge from the tree line, men and women in various states of decay, all wearing the remnants of logging gear, all sharing that same terrible smile. Some were missing limbs or chunks of flesh, revealing bone and sinew underneath. Others had extra appendages, additional arms or legs that looked like they'd been grafted on from other bodies. "The Henderson family," the lead figure continued, and I realized with horror that this must be referring to the elderly couple we'd met on the trail. "They told us you were coming." They're part of our family now, you see. Everyone who comes to our camp becomes part of our family, eventually." Sarah made a small whimpering sound, and I felt my own sanity beginning to fray at the edges. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank or shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But the smell of rot and decay that emanated from the approaching figures was all too real, as was the sound of their feet squelching in what I prayed was just mud. "What do you want?" Michael asked, and I was proud of how steady his voice sounded despite the circumstances. The thing that had once been human tilted its head at an unnatural angle, the movement accompanied by a wet, cracking sound. "Want? We want what we've always wanted. Workers for our camp. The logging must continue. You see, it never stops, not even after death." As if to illustrate his point, he gestured toward the ruins around us. In the strange blue-green light of our flickering stove, I could see that what I'd taken for old machinery was something else entirely. The rusted metal shapes were covered with what looked like flesh and sinew, pulsing with a rhythmic motion that suggested they were somehow alive. The symbols carved into everything weren't just decorations. They were some kind of binding marks, holding together abominations that defied natural law. "The camp must grow," the creature continued. "The work must continue. And you will help us, whether you want to or not." The circle of undead loggers began to tighten around our campsite, their movements slow but inexorable. I could see now that some of them were carrying tools, axes and saws that looked as corrupted as their wielders, the metal surfaces crawling with organic growth that pulsed and writhed. "Run," I whispered to the others. "On 3. Run toward the trail." "We can't leave our gear," Mark protested. "Fuck the gear," I hissed. 1, 2. But before I could say 3, Michael did something that changed everything. Instead of running, he lunged forward and kicked our camp stove, sending it flying into the gathered creatures. The flame went out instantly, plunging us into absolute darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then all hell broke loose. The creatures erupted in shrieks of rage and pain, the sound like a dozen chainsaws starting at once. In the darkness, I could hear them thrashing and stumbling, confused by the sudden loss of light. But I could also hear them beginning to organize, calling to each other in voices that sounded like grinding metal. "The trail!" I screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Find the trail!" We stumbled through the darkness, crashing into ruins and abandoned machinery, guided only by memory and desperation. Behind us, the creatures were recovering, and I could hear them beginning to pursue, their footsteps unnaturally loud in the absolute darkness. I ran into a concrete foundation and went down hard, skinning my knees on the rough surface. Sarah helped me up, and I could feel warm blood soaking through my pants. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror that drove us forward. "This way," Mark called from somewhere ahead, and I followed his voice, pulling Sarah with me. We crashed through underbrush and stumbled over fallen logs, making enough noise to wake the dead, which, given our circumstances, was probably exactly what we were doing. The creatures behind us were gaining ground, their pursuit accompanied by that horrible grinding sound that might have been laughter. But worse than their approach was the realization that they weren't just behind us. They were ahead of us too, moving through the forest with impossible speed to cut off our escape routes. "The trees," Sarah gasped beside me. "They're moving through the trees." She was right. I could hear them above us now, crashing through the canopy with inhuman agility, dropping down to block our path forward. We were being herded, driven deeper into the forest and away from any hope of escape. That's when I remembered something the elderly woman had said on the trail. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles back the way you came." "The ranger station," I panted to the others. "We need to find the ranger station." But in the absolute darkness of the forest, with our compasses spinning wildly and no landmarks to guide us, finding anything seemed impossible. We were lost, being hunted by things that shouldn't exist, in a landscape that defied logic and reason. The pursuit continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. We stumbled through dense undergrowth, splashed across icy streams, and climbed over fallen logs the size of small buildings. All the while, the creatures followed, their calls echoing through the forest as they communicated with each other in their grinding, metallic language. It was Mark who found salvation, quite literally stumbling over it in the darkness. One moment he was running beside us, the next he had disappeared with a crash and a string of creative cursing. "Down here," his voice called from below. "There's some kind of cave or tunnel." We followed the sound of his voice and found ourselves at the edge of what appeared to be an old mining shaft, its entrance partially concealed by fallen branches and decades of accumulated debris. Mark had fallen through the loose covering and was now calling up to us from about 10 feet below. "It's dry down here," he reported, "and I think it goes back pretty far. We could hide." The sound of our pursuers was growing closer, their shrieks and calls now coming from multiple directions as they closed in on our position. Without better options, we carefully lowered ourselves into the shaft, using exposed roots and rocky protrusions to climb down to where Mark was waiting. The tunnel was indeed dry, carved from solid rock in the style of 19th century mining operations. It stretched back into the mountain, disappearing into darkness that seemed even more absolute than the forest above. The air was stale and carried a metallic taste that coated our tongues and made breathing difficult. Above us, we could hear the creatures arrive at the entrance to the tunnel, their voices raised in frustration as they realized we had escaped their immediate grasp. But to my horror, I soon realized they weren't giving up. The sounds of digging and scraping began almost immediately, accompanied by that grinding laughter that suggested they found our hiding place amusing rather than frustrating. "They're widening the entrance," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then we go deeper," I replied, though the thought of venturing further into the unknown darkness of the tunnel filled me with dread. Using Mark's lighter for illumination, the only source of light we had left, we began making our way deeper into the mountain. The tunnel was roughly carved and showed signs of hasty abandonment. Tools lay scattered on the ground, and sections of wooden support beams had collapsed, forcing us to crawl through narrow openings. But it was the walls that truly disturbed me. They were covered with the same symbols we'd seen at the logging camp, carved deep into the living rock. And unlike the symbols above, these were clearly fresh, the stone around them still showing chisel marks that couldn't be more than a few days old. "Someone's been down here recently," Mark said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. That's when we found the bodies. They were arranged in a side chamber about 50 yards from the entrance, positioned in a careful circle around a central altar made from stacked stones. But these weren't old bones or mummified remains. These people had died recently, their clothes still relatively intact, their flesh in various stages of decay. I recognized one of them immediately, the elderly woman from the trail, still wearing her faded red jacket, though now it was stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Her walking stick lay beside her, its carved designs now making terrible sense as I realized they matched the symbols covering the tunnel walls. "The Hendersons," Sarah breathed, and I could hear the edge of hysteria in her voice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were still moving. Not alive, definitely not alive, but moving nonetheless. Small, subtle movements that suggested something was still animating their decaying flesh. The woman's fingers twitched occasionally, and I could swear I saw her chest rise and fall in a parody of breathing. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, stating the obvious with admirable understatement. But as we turned to leave, we discovered that the tunnel behind us was no longer empty. The creatures from the camp had found another way in, or perhaps they'd always had access to these tunnels. They stood between us and the entrance, their pale forms barely visible in the weak light of Mark's lighter. "The altar," the lead creature said, its voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "You found our altar. How perfect. The ritual can begin immediately." I looked around desperately for another exit, and my heart sank as I realized the chamber was a dead end. We were trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to fight creatures that were already dead. But Michael had other ideas. "You want us for your ritual?" he called out, and I could hear the challenge in his voice. "Come and get us." Before any of us could stop him, he grabbed one of the abandoned mining tools, a heavy pickaxe with a wooden handle, and charged toward the creatures blocking our exit. His battle cry echoed through the tunnel as he swung the tool in a wide arc, connecting with the lead creature's skull with a wet, cracking sound. The thing staggered but didn't fall, its head now sporting a massive dent that leaked something black and viscous. But Michael's attack had surprised them, creating a momentary opening in their ranks. "Run!" he screamed, continuing to swing the pickaxe as more creatures closed in on him. Sarah and I didn't need to be told twice. We pushed past the struggling figures and ran toward the tunnel entrance, Mark close behind us. But I could hear Michael's screams starting almost immediately, and they weren't screams of effort or exertion. They were screams of agony. I stopped and turned back, but Mark grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "He's buying us time," he said urgently. "Don't waste it." The screams continued for several more seconds, then cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear new sounds, wet, organic noises that suggested the creatures were doing things to Michael's body that my mind refused to process. We reached the tunnel entrance and hauled ourselves up into the forest above, emerging into what should have been dawn but was still the absolute darkness we'd been fleeing through. The forest around us was silent now, as if every living thing had fled or been consumed. "Which way?" Sarah gasped, looking around at the identical trees that surrounded us. I had no idea. In our panicked flight and time underground, I'd lost all sense of direction. The stars were invisible through the thick canopy, and without our failed GPS or compass, we had no way of determining which direction might lead to safety. That's when I heard it, a sound that filled me with both hope and terror. The distant rumble of an engine, barely audible through the trees. Civilization. People. Help. We followed the sound, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over unseen obstacles in our desperate attempt to reach whatever vehicle was out there. The engine noise grew louder, and I began to make out the rhythmic thrum of a diesel generator. The ranger station emerged from the darkness like a mirage, its windows glowing with warm electric light that seemed impossibly welcoming after the horrors we'd experienced. It was a small log cabin with a radio antenna and several official-looking vehicles parked outside. We burst through the front door without knocking, startling a middle-aged ranger who was sitting at a desk reading reports by lamplight. "Help us," Sarah sobbed, collapsing into a chair. "Please, you have to help us." The ranger, his name tag read Thompson, looked us over with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to dealing with lost hikers and camping mishaps. But his expression grew more serious as he took in our torn clothes, wild eyes, and obvious terror. "What happened?" he asked, reaching for his radio. "Are you folks injured?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that probably sounded like the ravings of someone in shock. Undead loggers, cursed mining tunnels, symbols carved in stone, my brother being torn apart by creatures that shouldn't exist. Thompson listened patiently, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying our faces in the lamplight. "The old logging camp," he said finally. "You went to the old logging camp." "You know about it?" Mark asked. Thompson nodded grimly. "We've had incidents there before. People going missing, strange reports from hikers. The Forest Service officially closed that area 2 years ago, but the signs keep getting torn down or defaced." He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder marked with official stamps and warnings. "We've documented 17 disappearances in that area over the past decade. Search and rescue never finds anything. No bodies, no gear, no trace. It's like people just vanish into thin air." "What about the creatures?" Sarah asked. "Sarah, the things that were chasing us?" Thompson's expression darkened. "There are stories, local legends about the logging camp, about what happened there in the 1940s. A cave-in that trapped dozens of workers underground. They say the company just sealed the entrances and left them to die rather than mount a rescue operation. The families were told it was too dangerous, that the men had died instantly. He pulled out several black and white photographs from the folder, images of the camp in its heyday. Workers posed next to massive machinery, families gathered for company picnics, children playing in the shadow of the great pines. But even in these cheerful historical documents, there was something unsettling about the scene. The workers' smiles seemed forced. Their eyes held a haunted quality, and the massive trees surrounding the camp looked exactly as they had tonight, pale and twisted, forming that perfect circle. But they didn't die instantly, did they? I said, understanding beginning to dawn. According to the stories, no. They survived down there for weeks, maybe months, eating whatever they could find, drinking contaminated water, slowly going mad in the darkness. When they finally died, the local tribes say their spirits were trapped by the symbols carved throughout the tunnels, symbols that were already there when the logging operation began. Thompson showed us another photograph, this one of the tunnel system we'd just escaped. But in this historical image, the symbols on the walls were clearly visible, and they were identical to the fresh carvings we'd seen. The symbols aren't from the miners, he continued. They're much older, pre-Columbian, according to the anthropologists who studied them before the area was closed. Some kind of binding ritual, designed to trap souls and prevent them from moving on to whatever comes after death. So those things we saw, Mark began, the spirits of the dead loggers, bound to the place where they died, slowly growing stronger and more malevolent with each passing year. And according to the legends, they're always looking for new workers to join their eternal shift. The implications of what he was telling us began to sink in. Michael wasn't just dead, he was trapped down there with those things, his soul bound to their cursed existence for eternity. We have to go back, I said, standing up despite my exhaustion. We have to get him out. Thompson shook his head firmly. Ma'am, with all due respect, your brother is gone. The best thing you can do now is stay as far away from that place as possible. But if what you're saying is true, if he's trapped there, then he's already becoming one of them, Thompson interrupted gently but firmly. I've seen it before. People who go missing in that area then show up weeks later trying to lure others back to the camp. They look human, they sound human, but they're not. Not anymore. As if to punctuate his words, there was a knock at the station door. A slow, deliberate series of raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and menacing. Thompson's face went pale. Nobody should be out there at this time of night, he whispered, reaching for the shotgun mounted on the wall behind his desk. The knock came again, more insistent now, followed by a familiar voice calling from outside. Jen? Sarah? Mark, are you in there? It's me, Michael. I got away. I need help. Sarah started toward the door, but I grabbed her arm. The voice was perfect, exactly like my brother's, but something about it was wrong. The cadence was off, like someone reading lines from a script they didn't quite understand. That's not him, I whispered. Thompson nodded, checking the shells in his shotgun. The missing people always come back eventually, but they're not the same. They're recruiting. Please, Michael's voice called again, and now I could hear the subtle wrongness in it more clearly. It was my brother's voice, but it lacked the emotional undertones that made speech human. It was like listening to a high-quality recording. I'm hurt. I need medical attention. Michael, I called back, my heart breaking even as I did what I knew was necessary. What was the name of your first pet? There was a pause, too long a pause for someone who should know the answer immediately. I'm hurt, Jen. I can't think straight. Please, just open the door. Thompson was already moving, securing additional locks and checking the windows. They can't come in uninvited, he said. Some kind of spiritual limitation. But they're very good at convincing people to invite them. My sister's in there, the thing outside continued, and now I could hear frustration creeping into its voice. Tell her I need to see her. Tell her I'm sorry about what happened underground." The detail about underground made Sarah gasp. How could it know that unless it really is Michael, I finished. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The thing outside might have Michael's memories, might even have fragments of his personality, but it wasn't my brother. My brother would never have spoken about what happened underground in that flat, emotionless tone. The knocking stopped, and for several minutes we heard nothing from outside. Thompson used the silence to contact his superiors on the radio, speaking in codes and abbreviations that clearly indicated this wasn't the first time he'd dealt with this situation. "Backup is coming," he told us when he finished the transmission, "but it'll be a few hours before they can get here. We need to hold tight until dawn." "Why dawn?" Mark asked. "The spirits are strongest in darkness. When the sun comes up, they retreat back to the tunnels. It's not a permanent solution, but it gives us time to get you folks out of here safely." That's when the lights went out. The sudden plunge into darkness was accompanied by the sound of the generator outside sputtering and dying. In the absolute blackness of the cabin, I could hear all of us breathing heavily, trying to stay calm despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm our rational minds. Thompson's voice came from somewhere near his desk. "Emergency lanterns are in the supply closet. Nobody move until I get some light going." But before he could reach the lanterns, we heard the sound of breaking glass from one of the windows. Cold night air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the smell of decay and corruption that we'd encountered at the logging camp. "They can't come in uninvited," Thompson had said, but apparently they could break windows and reach inside. Something pale and grasping thrust through the broken window, feeling around in the darkness for anything it could grab. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to stay as far away from those searching fingers as possible. Thompson's flashlight clicked on, its beam revealing the arm that had invaded our sanctuary. It was definitely Michael's arm. I recognized the scar on his wrist from a childhood accident, but the flesh was already showing signs of decay, and the fingernails had grown into sharp, claw-like points. The ranger didn't hesitate. His shotgun boomed in the confined space, and the arm jerked back through the window with a shriek that sounded like my brother's voice mixed with the grinding of metal on stone. "That'll keep them back for a few minutes," Thompson said, but his voice was tight with stress. "But they'll find another way. They always do." As if summoned by his words, we heard sounds from all around the cabin. Footsteps on the roof, scratching at the walls, the subtle creaking of wood under supernatural pressure. They were testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. "The basement," Thompson said suddenly. "There's a tunnel that connects to the old mine workings. It's how the original rangers accessed the area before the roads were built. If we can get down there—" He led us to a concealed door behind his desk, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The basement was cramped and filled with emergency supplies, but at the far end, barely visible in the flashlight beam, was another tunnel entrance. "This connects to the main mine system about a mile from here," Thompson explained as we gathered what supplies we could carry. "It'll bring us out near the highway, where backup can pick us up." But as we prepared to enter the tunnel, I realized something that made my blood run cold. If this tunnel system connected to the old mine workings, then it probably connected to the chamber where we'd found the bodies, which meant we were about to enter the creature's domain voluntarily. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Thompson. He paused at the tunnel entrance, his flashlight illuminating carved symbols that were becoming depressingly familiar. "No," he admitted, "but staying here isn't an option anymore." Above us, the sounds of the creature's assault on the cabin were growing more intense. Windows were breaking. Walls were being torn apart, and I could hear that horrible grinding laughter getting closer. We entered the tunnel just as something large crashed through the ceiling of the cabin above. The beam of Thompson's flashlight revealed a passage that was wider and better maintained than the mining tunnels we'd fled earlier, with modern supports and electrical conduits suggesting it was still in active use. But it was also covered with those same binding symbols, carved into every surface with obsessive thoroughness. Someone, or something, had spent considerable time ensuring that these tunnels were properly prepared for their intended purpose. "How long has this been going on?" I asked Thompson as we moved through the passage. "The disappearances? Officially, about 10 years. Unofficially, there are records going back to the 1940s, right after the mine collapse. But it's been getting worse recently, more aggressive, more organized." "Why?" "We think they're getting stronger. Each new person they trap adds to their power, their ability to affect the physical world. In the beginning, they could barely manifest visually. Now they can manipulate electronics, move objects, even briefly animate dead flesh." The implications of what he was saying were terrifying. If the creatures continued to grow stronger, eventually they might not be confined to the mining area. They could spread, hunting throughout the entire region, adding to their numbers with each victim. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when Thompson suddenly stopped, his flashlight beam fixed on something ahead. The tunnel split into multiple passages, each one marked with different symbols and leading off into the darkness. "This isn't right," he muttered, consulting a map he'd pulled from his pocket. "There should only be one tunnel here. These other passages, they weren't on the original survey." As we studied the branching paths, I began to notice that some of the symbols carved into the walls were glowing with a faint phosphorescent light, not bright enough to illuminate much but visible in the darkness like tiny stars, and they seemed to be pulsing in a slow, rhythmic pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. "They're active," Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The binding symbols are active. That means—" He didn't need to finish. We all understood. The creatures knew we were here, in their domain, and they were preparing something. That's when we heard the voices. They came from all around us, echoing through the tunnel system from multiple directions. Familiar voices, calling our names, pleading for help. I heard Michael, of course, but also Sarah's mother, Mark's ex-girlfriend, people from our past who had no business being in these mountains. "Don't listen," Thompson warned. "They're using the memories of their victims to create the voices. Nothing you hear down here is real." But it was difficult to ignore the sound of my mother calling my name, her voice filled with the same concern she'd shown throughout my childhood. Even knowing it was an illusion, the emotional impact was devastating. Sarah was crying silently beside me, tears streaming down her face as she listened to voices from her past. Mark had gone completely pale, his hands shaking as he gripped his emergency flashlight. The voices grew louder and more insistent, coming from the branching passages that surrounded us. And with them came other sounds. Footsteps, the scratch of claws on stone, the wet, dragging noises of bodies being moved through narrow spaces. "Which way?" I asked Thompson urgently. He studied his map again, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. I'm not certain. The tunnels have changed since this map was made. These additional passages shouldn't exist." "Then we pick one and hope for the best," Mark said, his voice steadier than I would have expected given the circumstances. Thompson nodded and pointed toward the leftmost passage. "That one seems to head in the general direction of the highway. We'll try it." But as we entered the chosen tunnel, the voices behind us changed. Instead of pleading and calling our names, they began laughing. The same grinding, metallic laughter we'd heard at the logging camp. But now it was coming from dozens of throats, creating a cacophony of inhuman mirth that followed us deeper into the underground maze. The tunnel we'd chosen sloped steadily downward, taking us deeper into the mountain rather than toward the surface. After several minutes of walking, it became clear that we were not heading toward the highway as Thompson had hoped. "We need to go back," Sarah said, but when we turned around, the passage behind us was gone. Where the tunnel had been, there was now only solid rock, as if the opening had never existed. "That's impossible," Thompson said, running his hands over the smooth stone surface. But it was undeniably real. We were trapped in a passage that was leading us deeper underground, toward whatever waited in the heart of the mountain. The voices had stopped now, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse, the rhythmic thudding of something large moving through the tunnels parallel to our path. Something that was keeping pace with us, matching our speed exactly as it moved through passages we couldn't see. It's herding us, I realized, just like in the forest. It's driving us toward something specific. Thompson's face was grim as he consulted his compass, which was spinning wildly without settling on any direction. The magnetic fields down here are all wrong. Either there's some kind of mineral deposit affecting the instruments, or what? Or we're not in normal space anymore. Some of the older reports mentioned temporal and spatial distortions around the mining area. Passages that led to places that shouldn't exist, distances that didn't match the maps. As if to confirm his words, we rounded a corner and found ourselves in a vast underground chamber that was impossibly large for the mountain we'd entered. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above our heads, and the walls stretched away into shadows that our flashlights couldn't penetrate. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made us all stop in horror. It was a machine, but not like any machine created by human hands. Massive and organic-looking, it pulsed with the same rhythm as the glowing symbols we'd been seeing throughout the tunnels. Pipes and cables that looked more like arteries and nerves connected it to the surrounding walls, and from its depths came the sound of grinding metal mixed with human screams. Around the base of the machine, figures moved in endless procession. The missing hikers, the dead loggers, all of them working to feed the machine with materials I didn't want to identify. They moved with the jerky, purposeful motions of puppets, their eyes reflecting the phosphorescent glow that emanated from the device. "My God," Thompson whispered. "What is that thing?" But I was beginning to understand, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together in my mind. The symbols weren't just binding spirits to this place, they were powering something. The machine was some kind of engine, and the trapped souls were its fuel. "It's a gateway," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They're building a gateway. As if responding to my words, the machine's rhythm increased, its pulsing growing more rapid and intense. The symbols throughout the chamber began glowing brighter, and the air itself seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. That's when I saw him. Michael stood near the base of the machine, his movements matching the jerky puppet-like motions of the other workers. But unlike them, he looked up when we entered the chamber, his eyes meeting mine across the vast space. For just a moment, I saw recognition there. Not the blank stare of the possessed, but actual awareness. My brother was still in there, fighting against whatever was controlling him. "Jen," he called out, and this time his voice carried all the emotional undertones that had been missing from the thing at the ranger station. "Help me." I started toward him without thinking, but Thompson grabbed my arm. "It's a trap," he said. "Even if part of him is still aware, he's being controlled by the machine. The moment you get close enough, it'll take you too." But I could see the desperate hope in Michael's eyes, could hear the pain in his voice as he called my name again. Whatever was happening to him, some part of my brother was still fighting, still trying to break free. The machine's rhythm was increasing steadily now, building toward some kind of crescendo. Around its base, more figures were appearing. Not just the dead loggers and missing hikers, but people in modern clothing who must have been recent victims. The elderly couple from the trail were there, their movements as puppet-like as the others. "It's almost ready," Thompson said, his voice filled with awe and terror. "Whatever this thing is designed to do, it's almost ready to do it." I looked around the chamber, taking in the scope of what we were facing. Dozens of trapped souls, all of them feeding energy into a machine designed for purposes I could barely comprehend. And somewhere in that mass of the controlled dead, my brother was fighting for his humanity. "There has to be a way to stop it," I said. Thompson was studying the symbols carved into the walls around us, his flashlight beam revealing the intricate patterns that covered every surface. "The binding marks," he said suddenly. "They're not just powering the machine, they're containing it. If we could disrupt the pattern, how?" "Fire. The symbols are carved into the rock, but they're filled with some kind of organic compound that makes them glow. If we could burn out enough of them, it might break the binding. I looked at our meager supplies, a few emergency flares from the ranger station, a small container of lighter fluid, Thompson's ancient Zippo. Not much to work with, but possibly enough if we were strategic about it. The symbols form a circuit, Mark observed, his technical background finally proving useful. Break the circuit in enough places, and the whole system fails. We spread out around the chamber, each of us targeting a section of the symbol-covered walls. The trapped figures continued their work around the machine, seemingly oblivious to our presence. But I could feel awareness focusing on us from somewhere in that mechanical monstrosity. I lit my first flare and held it against a cluster of symbols near what appeared to be a main conduit. The organic material filling the carved grooves caught fire immediately, burning with a bright blue flame that cast dancing shadows on the chamber walls. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The machine's rhythm stuttered, its pulsing becoming irregular as power flow was disrupted. Several of the trapped figures stumbled, their puppet-like movements becoming even more erratic. Sarah and Mark were having similar success with their sections of the symbol network, while Thompson worked on what appeared to be a control cluster near the chamber's entrance. Each burning symbol caused the machine to shudder and spark, its supernatural mechanisms struggling to maintain stability. But our sabotage was not going unnoticed. As more symbols burned out, the trapped figures began turning toward us, their empty eyes now focused with predatory intent. They moved away from the machine and began approaching our positions, their movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful. "They're coming for us," Sarah called out, her voice tight with fear. I lit another flare and continued burning symbols, even as the nearest figures closed in on my position. But these weren't the shambling zombies of popular fiction. They moved with inhuman speed and coordination, their decaying hands reaching for me with deadly purpose. Thompson's shotgun boomed across the chamber, the blast knocking down several of the approaching figures. But they got back up almost immediately, apparently unaffected by physical damage. "The symbols!" he shouted. "Keep burning the symbols. It's our only chance." I dodged a grasping hand and pressed my flare against another cluster of carvings. The blue flames spread along the grooves, consuming the organic compounds and breaking another section of the binding circuit. The machine was in serious distress now, its pulsing completely erratic as power flows fluctuated wildly. Sparks and supernatural energy crackled from its organic components, and the rhythmic grinding sound was being replaced by something that sounded almost like screaming. That's when Michael broke free. I saw it happen from across the chamber. One moment he was moving with the same puppet-like motions as the others. The next, he was himself again, looking around in confusion and horror at his surroundings. "Jen," he called out, his voice clear and strong. "The core. You have to destroy the core." He pointed toward the heart of the machine, where a pulsing mass of organic and mechanical components seemed to be the source of all the supernatural energy in the chamber. But even as he spoke, I could see other figures converging on his position, drawn by his sudden independence from their collective will. He fought them with desperate strength, but there were too many of them. I had one flare left, and the core was at least 50 yards away through a crowd of increasingly agitated undead. The logical part of my mind knew it was suicide to attempt it. But the part of me that had spent 32 years as Michael's older sister knew I had to try. I ran. The chamber erupted in chaos as I sprinted toward the machine's core, dodging grasping hands and leaping over obstacles that might have been machinery or might have been something worse. Behind me, I could hear Thompson's shotgun continuing to boom, and Sarah screaming my name. The trapped figures tried to intercept me, but the disruption of the symbol network had made their movements increasingly uncoordinated. I made it halfway to the core before one of them managed to grab my ankle, sending me sprawling across the chamber floor. I rolled away from grasping hands and struggled back to my feet, but I was surrounded now. Dead faces stared at me with empty sockets, and rotting hands reached for me from all directions. That's when Mark arrived like a heroic fool, swinging one of the mining tools he'd picked up somewhere in our flight. His improvised weapon connected with several of the figures, knocking them back long enough for me to break free from their circle. "Go!" he shouted, continuing to fight despite the hopelessness of the situation. "Finish it." I ran the last 30 yards to the machine's core, my remaining flare held high like a torch. The pulsing mass of organic machinery loomed above me, its surface covered with the same phosphorescent symbols that had been guiding us through this nightmare. The core was beautiful in its alien horror, a perfect fusion of technology and biology that pulsed with supernatural life. As I approached, I could hear voices emanating from within it, the voices of everyone who had been consumed by this place, their consciousness trapped within the machine's organic matrix. I could hear Michael's voice among them, and Sarah's mother, and countless others stretching back decades, all of them calling for release, begging for an end to their supernatural imprisonment. I pressed the flare against the core's surface. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The entire chamber filled with brilliant blue light as the core began to burn, its organic components consumed by flames that spread faster than any natural fire. The machine's screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The trapped figures throughout the chamber suddenly stopped moving. Their puppet strings cut as the power source that animated them was destroyed. They collapsed where they stood, finally granted the rest that had been denied them for so long. But the chamber itself was beginning to collapse as well. The supernatural forces that had been holding this impossible space together were failing, and reality was reasserting itself with violent consequences. Chunks of ceiling began falling and the walls started to crack and crumble. "Run!" Thompson shouted from across the chamber. "The whole place is coming down." We ran, dodging falling debris and leaping over widening cracks in the floor. Behind us, the burning core continued to scream as it was consumed, its death throes shaking the entire mountain. Michael was with us now, freed from the machine's control, though he moved with the unsteady gait of someone who had been through unimaginable trauma. Sarah and Mark flanked him, helping him keep pace as we fled the collapsing chamber. Thompson led us toward what he claimed was another exit, though in the chaos and destruction it was impossible to tell if we were heading toward safety or deeper into the mountain. The tunnel we followed was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for us to run single file. Behind us, the sounds of destruction continued, the grinding crash of falling stone, the screaming of supernatural forces being torn apart, and underneath it all, a sound like the world's largest machine grinding to a halt. We emerged from the tunnel system just as the sun was rising, stumbling out of a cave entrance I hadn't even noticed during our flight. The morning light was impossibly beautiful after the darkness we'd endured, and I fell to my knees in the pine needles, gasping in clean air that didn't taste of death and decay. Thompson's backup had arrived during the night, several Forest Service vehicles and a search and rescue team that looked relieved to see us emerge from the mountain alive. But as we tried to explain what had happened, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Underground machines powered by trapped souls, undead loggers, symbols that bent reality. It sounded like the ravings of people who had been through severe trauma, which I suppose we had. But Thompson backed up our story, and he had the official reports to support at least some of what we'd experienced. The area was cordoned off permanently, not just closed to hikers, but actually sealed with concrete barriers and federal warning signs. Michael spent 3 weeks in a hospital, recovering from injuries that doctors couldn't fully explain. Malnutrition, exposure, and trauma were the official diagnoses, but I could see in his eyes that he remembered everything. We never talked about it directly, but sometimes late at night he would call me, and we would stay on the phone in comfortable silence, just reassuring ourselves that the other was still alive and still human. Sarah went back to her old job, but she was different now. The eternal optimism that had defined her personality was tempered by a new understanding of how dark the world could be. She started volunteering with search and rescue teams, driven by a need to help people who were lost in the wilderness. Mark became obsessed with researching the historical background of what we'd experienced. He spent months in archives and libraries, piecing together the full story of the Calpine logging operation and the mine collapse that had started everything. According to his research, the symbols we'd encountered were indeed pre-Columbian, part of a ritual system designed to trap spirits and prevent them from crossing over to whatever comes after death. The original Native American inhabitants of the area had known about the symbols and had carefully avoided them, understanding their dangerous nature. But when white settlers arrived and began logging operations, they'd unknowingly built their camp directly on top of the ancient binding site. The mine collapse hadn't been an accident, Mark discovered. It had been deliberately triggered by someone who understood the symbol's purpose and wanted to create a large-scale spiritual trap. Dozens of workers had been sacrificed to power whatever the machine in the underground chamber had been designed to accomplish. As for what that purpose might have been, we could only speculate. A gateway to somewhere else, perhaps, or a machine for harvesting and storing human consciousness. Thompson's official reports were classified at a level none of us could access, so we were left with questions that would probably never be answered. The area around Calpine remained closed, but Mark's research suggested there were other sites throughout the western United States with similar characteristics. Places where ancient binding symbols had been carved into stone, where people disappeared under mysterious circumstances, where the boundary between life and death seemed unusually thin. I returned to my job at the marketing firm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our experience had marked us in some fundamental way. We had seen behind the curtain of reality and discovered that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than we'd ever imagined. Sometimes, late at night, I would dream about the machine in the underground chamber. In these dreams, it wasn't destroyed but was somehow still functioning, still calling to people, still trying to complete whatever purpose it had been designed for. I would wake up with the taste of metal and decay in my mouth, and it would take hours for the feeling to fade. 6 months after our experience, I received a call from Thompson. His voice was tight with concern as he explained that other people had gone missing in areas throughout the Sierra Nevada mountains. Different locations, but always places with pre-Columbian symbols carved into the stone. Always remote areas that had experienced some kind of historical tragedy. "I think there are more of them," he said. "More machines, more binding sites. What you folks destroyed at Calpine was just one part of something much larger." I asked him what he thought we should do about it, though I dreaded the answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that you folks might be the only people who really understand what we're dealing with. You've seen it, you've survived it, and you've proven it can be stopped." The implication was clear. He was asking us to hunt these things down, to seek out the other binding sites and destroy them before they could claim more victims. It was a terrifying prospect, but I found myself considering it seriously. Because the truth was, I couldn't forget the voices I'd heard emanating from the machine's core. All those trapped souls, crying out for release, begging for someone to end their supernatural imprisonment. If there were more machines out there, that meant there were more people suffering the same fate Michael had endured. I called the others and explained Thompson's request. The response was mixed. Sarah was horrified by the idea of deliberately seeking out more supernatural dangers, while Mark was grimly determined to prevent others from experiencing what we'd been through. Michael was the most conflicted, torn between his desire to help and his fear of facing those creatures again. In the end, we agreed to help Thompson investigate one more site, a place in the Olympic Mountains of Washington where several hikers had disappeared under circumstances similar to what we'd experienced. Just one more, we told ourselves, just to see if our experience at Calpine had been unique or part of a larger pattern. But as I packed my gear for another wilderness expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something much larger and more dangerous than any of us realized. The symbols we'd encountered weren't just ancient carvings. They were part of a network, a system designed to harvest human consciousness on a massive scale. And somewhere in the darkness between life and death, the architects of that system were still working, still building, still preparing for whatever ultimate purpose their machines were designed to serve. The wilderness was calling us back, and despite everything we'd been through, I knew we would answer that call. because someone had to stand between the darkness and the innocent people who might stumble into it. Someone had to make sure that no one else would face the horror we'd survived in those tunnels beneath the Sierra Nevada mountains. But as I closed my eyes that night, trying to push away the memories of grinding machines and trapped souls, I couldn't help but wonder if we were walking into a trap. If the forces we'd encountered at Calpine had been testing us, measuring our capabilities, preparing us for some larger role in their incomprehensible plans. The symbols were calling, and despite my fear, I knew I would follow them into whatever darkness awaited. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Sierra Nevada mountains, near the Ansel Adams Wilderness in California, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my college roommate, David. The drive up Highway 395 had been uneventful, the kind of peaceful journey that makes you forget about deadlines and conference calls. David and I hadn't seen each other in nearly 2 years, not since his divorce, and this trip was meant to be a chance to reconnect away from the noise of our respective lives in Los Angeles. We'd chosen a secluded area near Mammoth Lakes, far from the popular camping spots that draw weekend warriors and Instagram influencers. "Remember when we used to do this every summer?" David asked as we turned off the main road onto a dirt track that wound deeper into the forest. His voice carried a forced cheerfulness that I'd noticed more frequently since Sarah left him. "Yeah," I replied, though I wasn't sure I did remember it quite the same way. Our college camping trips had usually involved more beer than hiking, more talking than actual wilderness appreciation. But David seemed to need this narrative of shared adventure, so I didn't correct him. The trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, "Thousand Island Lake Trail, 6.2 miles. Below it, someone had carved "Turn Back" in jagged letters, though the wood around it was so faded it could have been decades old. David laughed when he saw it. "Probably some kid trying to scare people away from their secret fishing spot," he said, shouldering his pack. But I noticed he avoided looking at the carving directly. We set off into the forest around 2 p.m., later than we'd planned due to David's insistence on stopping for coffee and what he called proper trail food. Expensive energy bars and electrolyte drinks that seemed more about performance anxiety than actual nutrition. The trail began gently enough, winding through stands of Jeffrey pine and white fir that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. For the first hour, we fell into an easy rhythm. David talked almost constantly about work, about his ex-wife, about a documentary he'd watched about people who disappeared in national parks. The last topic seemed to fascinate him in an unhealthy way. "Did you know that the National Park Service doesn't actually keep comprehensive records of missing persons?" he said as we crossed a small creek on a fallen log. "There could be hundreds of people who just vanished without a trace." "That's comforting," I muttered. But David didn't seem to hear the sarcasm. "I'm serious, Mike. There are cases where experienced hikers, people who knew what they were doing, just disappeared. No bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing. Like they just stopped existing." I was beginning to remember why our friendship had grown distant. David had always been prone to obsessions, but since the divorce, these fixations had taken on a darker edge. Still, being in the wilderness was supposed to help both of us, so I tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics. The first sign that something was wrong came around mile 3, when we should have reached Garnet Lake. According to our map and GPS, we were in the right location, but there was no lake. Instead, we found ourselves in a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines that seemed to lean inward, creating an oppressive canopy that blocked most of the late afternoon sun. "This isn't right," I said, checking my phone. The GPS showed our location as a blue dot floating in what should have been water. "We should be at the lake." David consulted his paper map, turning it in different directions as if the topography might rearrange itself to match our surroundings. "Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere. These trails can be confusing." But I'd been checking our progress carefully, and I was certain we'd stayed on the main trail. There hadn't been any significant turns or junctions where we could have gone astray. "Let's backtrack a bit," I suggested. "Maybe there's a marker we missed?" We spent the next 30 minutes retracing our steps, but the trail seemed to have changed. Landmarks I was certain I'd noticed on the way up, a distinctive boulder, a tree with a lightning scar, were nowhere to be found. Worse, the trail itself seemed different, narrower in some places, wider in others, as if the forest had shifted while we weren't looking. "This is impossible," David said, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of genuine concern rather than forced enthusiasm. We decided to make camp in the clearing, reasoning that it was better to stop while we still had daylight than to risk getting more lost in the dark. As we set up our tents, I noticed that the clearing was perfectly circular, as if it had been deliberately carved out of the forest. The trees around the perimeter were all roughly the same height and species, creating an almost artificial uniformity that made me uncomfortable. "You notice anything weird about this place?" I asked David as we gathered deadwood for a fire. He looked around, his eyes moving in slow sweeps across the tree line. "It's quiet. Really quiet." He was right. I hadn't noticed it before, but there were no bird sounds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. We built our fire in the center of the clearing, but the flames seemed reluctant to catch, guttering and smoking even though the wood was dry and we'd arranged it properly. When it finally did light, the flames burned with an odd blue-green tinge that neither of us mentioned, though I saw David staring at it with a troubled expression. As night fell, the silence became even more oppressive. We sat by the fire eating our trail meals and trying to maintain normal conversation, but our voices seemed muffled and small in the vast quiet. Several times I had the sensation that someone was listening just beyond the circle of firelight, but when I looked toward the trees, I saw only darkness. "So," David said, poking at the fire with a stick, "what do you think happened to all the animals?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, we haven't seen a single bird, squirrel, chipmunk, nothing, even insects. It's like everything just left." I didn't have an answer for that, and the question hung in the air like smoke. We went to bed early, around 9 p.m., though neither of us was particularly tired. It just seemed preferable to lying awake by the fire, listening to the oppressive silence and watching David grow more agitated. I woke sometime in the early morning hours to the sound of David's voice. At first, I thought he was talking to me, but as I became more alert, I realized he was outside his tent, speaking to someone else. The words were too muffled to understand, but the cadence was conversational, almost friendly. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. David was standing about 10 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, facing the trees. He was still in his sleeping bag, but somehow upright, his arms at his sides as if he were sleepwalking. "David?" I whispered. He didn't respond. In the faint starlight, I could see his lips moving, but I couldn't hear any words. He stood perfectly still except for his mouth, carrying on what appeared to be a detailed conversation with something in the darkness between the trees. I called his name louder, and this time he turned toward me. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when he spoke, his voice had a strange, hollow quality. "They want to know if you're ready," he said. "Ready for what?" "David, what are you talking about?" He blinked several times, and his expression shifted to confusion. "Mike? What? Why am I outside?" "You were sleepwalking, talking to someone." David looked around the clearing, then back at the trees where he'd been facing. "I don't remember. I was having the strangest dream. There were people calling to me from the forest. They said they knew the way out." We both went back to our tents, but I didn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening for any sound that might indicate David was moving around again. But the silence had returned, deeper than before. Every few minutes I could swear I heard whispering just at the edge of perception, like voices carried on a wind that I couldn't feel. When dawn finally came, David seemed completely normal, chatting about the beautiful sunrise and how well he'd slept after the initial confusion. But I noticed he avoided looking directly at the section of forest where he'd been standing in the night. We broke camp quickly, both eager to get back on the trail and find our way to civilization. But as we shouldered our packs, David stopped suddenly. "Mike, where's my water bottle?" I looked around the campsite. We'd been careful to pack everything, but David's bright red water bottle was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe it fell out of your pack," I suggested, though I'd watched him secure everything carefully. We searched the entire clearing, even checking inside our tents again, but the bottle had simply vanished. More unsettling was what we found instead. Arranged in a neat line at the spot where David had been sleepwalking were 6 small stones, each about the size of a golf ball, each carved with symbols that looked vaguely like letters but in no alphabet I recognized. "Did you put these here?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I shook my head. The stones were warm to the touch despite the cool morning air, and when I picked one up it seemed to vibrate slightly in my palm, like a tuning fork struck softly. "We need to get out of here," I said. David nodded, but as we left the clearing, I noticed him slip one of the stones into his pocket. The trail seemed even more confused in daylight. What had been a clear path the day before now branched and forked in impossible ways. We would follow what appeared to be the main route, only to find ourselves back at the same clearing after an hour of hiking. Each time we returned, something was different. Our campfire was unlit when we'd left coals burning, or our tent stakes were arranged in different patterns, or there were more of those carved stones arranged in increasingly complex designs. By midday, panic was setting in. We'd been hiking for 4 hours and seemed to be going in circles. Our water was running low, and David had begun talking to himself in low, urgent whispers that reminded me uncomfortably of his midnight conversation with the trees. "The ranger station," I said, checking my map for the 100th time. "If we can just get to the main trail, we can follow it back to the ranger station." "What if there is no main trail anymore?" David asked. His voice was strangely calm, which worried me more than panic would have. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if this place doesn't want us to leave? What if the trails only exist when it allows them to?" I stared at him. "David, that's impossible. Trails don't just disappear." He pulled the carved stone from his pocket and held it up. In the daylight, I could see that the symbols on its surface were moving, shifting like living things carved in rock. "Then explain this," he said. I couldn't. The stone was definitely changing, the symbols rearranging themselves into new patterns as we watched. But admitting that would mean accepting that something fundamentally impossible was happening, and I wasn't ready for that yet. "We're dehydrated," I said instead. "Stressed. People see things when they're under stress." David smiled, but it wasn't his usual expression. It was too wide, lasted too long, and didn't reach his eyes. "You're probably right," he said, but he kept the stone in his hand, turning it over and over with his fingers. We pressed on, trying different paths through the forest, but each route led us back to the same clearing. Worse, each time we returned, David seemed more distant, more disconnected from our situation. He would stop in the middle of conversations, his head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I asked him about it, he would blink and apologize, saying he thought he'd heard voices calling. As afternoon wore into evening, I realized we would have to spend another night in the clearing. The prospect filled me with dread, but we were running out of options. Our water was nearly gone, and David had begun stumbling, his coordination deteriorating in a way that suggested more than just fatigue. "We'll try again tomorrow," I said as we set up camp for the second time. "Maybe we'll see something we missed." David nodded absently. He was holding the carved stone again, and I noticed that his thumb was bleeding where he'd been rubbing it against the surface. "David, you're hurt." He looked down at his thumb with mild surprise. "Oh, I didn't notice." The wound was deeper than it should have been from simple friction, almost as if something sharp had cut him, but the stone's surface appeared smooth and worn. That night I decided to stay awake and watch David. I pretended to go to sleep early but kept my tent flap partially unzipped so I could monitor the clearing. Sure enough, around midnight, I heard the soft whisper of a sleeping bag zipper. David emerged from his tent, but something was wrong with the way he moved. His motions were too fluid, too coordinated for someone who should have been stumbling around in darkness. He walked to the same spot near the tree line where he'd stood the night before, but this time I could hear voices answering him. They were soft, sibilant whispers that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was coaxing, persuasive. David nodded frequently as he listened, occasionally responding in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. After about 10 minutes, he began walking toward the trees. I scrambled out of my tent. "David, stop!" He paused at the edge of the clearing but didn't turn around. "They're showing me the way out," he said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of emotion. "They know where the real trail is." "David, there's no one there. You're sleepwalking again." Now he did turn, and in the starlight I could see that his eyes were completely black, as if his pupils had expanded to fill the entire visible surface. "You can come too," he said. "They said you're welcome. All you have to do is let them in." He held up the carved stone, and I could see symbols flowing across its surface like living tattoos. The stone was glowing with a faint phosphorescent light that made David's skin look gray and waxy. "Put the stone down, David." He smiled again, that too wide expression that wasn't quite human. "Why? It's beautiful. It's showing me such interesting things." Behind him, I began to see movement in the darkness between the trees. Pale shapes that might have been faces, or hands, or something else entirely. They swayed gently back and forth, keeping time with some rhythm I couldn't hear. "David, step away from the trees. Come back to the fire." "Fire," he repeated as if the word were foreign. "Yes, they don't like fire very much, but they don't need to worry about that much longer." I looked back at our campfire and felt my blood turn to ice water. The flames had turned completely blue and were shrinking rapidly, as if something were sucking the heat and light out of them. "They're hungry," David said conversationally. "They've been waiting so long for someone to find this place, someone to invite them in." The pale shapes in the forest were moving closer, and I could see that they weren't quite human. They had too many joints in their arms and legs, and their faces were smooth and featureless except for dark holes where eyes and mouths should be. I grabbed a burning stick from our dying fire and held it like a torch. The blue flames flickered weakly, but they seemed to make the pale shapes hesitate. "David, we need to go. Now." "Go." He tilted his head, and I heard vertebrae crack in his neck. "But we just got here. They've been preparing such a wonderful welcome for us." One of the pale shapes reached out from between the trees, its arms stretching impossibly long to almost touch David's shoulder. Where I expected to see fingers, there were only sharp points of bone or horn. I lunged forward and grabbed David's arm, pulling him away from the reaching thing. He stumbled, and the carved stone fell from his hand, hitting the ground with a sound like breaking glass. Immediately, the forest erupted in a sound that was part shriek, part wind, part something else entirely. The pale shapes writhed and twisted, and David doubled over as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "Mike?" His voice was his own again, confused and frightened. "What's happening? Where are we?" "We're leaving, right now." I grabbed our packs, not bothering with proper packing, just stuffing sleeping bags and essential gear into the bags as quickly as possible. David stood swaying in the middle of the clearing, looking around with growing panic. I remember. They were in my head. They were showing me things. Horrible things they wanted to do. "Don't think about it. We just need to get out of here." The broken stone on the ground was still glowing, but the light was fading rapidly. As it dimmed, the sounds from the forest grew louder and more urgent. I could hear branches breaking as something large moved through the trees, circling our clearing. We ran. I'm not sure which direction we went, and I don't think it mattered anymore. The normal rules of geography seemed to have broken down completely. We crashed through underbrush that tore at our clothes and skin, following what might have been a trail or might have been an animal path, or might have been nothing at all. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. I could hear David breathing hard, occasionally whimpering when branches whipped across his face. But he kept running, and that was what mattered. We must have run for hours, though it felt like minutes and days at the same time. The forest seemed endless, a maze of identical trees and shadows that offered no landmarks or sense of direction. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, David grabbed my arm. "Look," he gasped. Ahead of us, impossibly, was a light. Not the pale, cold glow of the carved stone or the blue flames of our corrupted campfire, but the warm, yellow light of electric bulbs. As we got closer, I could make out the shape of a building, a ranger station with a parking lot where 2 vehicles sat waiting. We stumbled out of the tree line like refugees from a war zone, our clothes torn, our skin scratched and bleeding. The ranger on duty, a middle-aged woman named Martinez according to her name tag, took one look at us and called for a medical team. "How long have you been lost?" she asked as we sat in her office, drinking coffee and trying to stop shaking. 2 days, I said automatically, then stopped. It felt like we'd been in that clearing for weeks, but according to my watch it had been less than 48 hours since we'd left the trailhead. "What trail were you on?" David and I looked at each other. "Thousand Island Lake," David said. "But we got turned around somehow." Ranger Martinez frowned and consulted a large map on her wall. "That's strange. Thousand Island Lake Trail is well marked and it's almost impossible to get lost if you stay on the main path." "We found this clearing," I said, not sure how to explain the rest. "It was perfectly round, surrounded by trees. We couldn't find the trail after that." Her frown deepened. "A circular clearing? Can you show me on the map where you think it was?" I studied the topographical map, trying to match the terrain to my memory of our route, but nothing looked familiar. According to the map, there was no clearing anywhere near where we should have been, just continuous forest marked with elevation lines and trail markers. "I don't understand," I said. "It should be right here, but—" "Sometimes the forest can be disorienting," Martinez said diplomatically, "especially when you're tired or stressed. The mind can play tricks on you." We gave our statements and accepted a ride back to our car at the trailhead. The drive down the mountain was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that David spoke. "Mike." "Yeah?" "Do you still have your phone?" I checked my pocket. My phone was there, but when I turned it on, the screen was completely black. Not dead. The power indicator showed a full charge, but black, as if the display had been burned out from the inside. David checked his phone and found the same thing. 2 devices, completely functional except for screens that showed nothing but darkness. We drove back to Los Angeles in silence, both of us trying to convince ourselves that we'd experienced some kind of shared hallucination brought on by dehydration and stress. But I couldn't forget the feeling of that carved stone in my hand, or the way David's eyes had looked when whatever was in the forest had been speaking through him. 3 weeks later, David called me at work. "Mike, I've been doing some research on that area where we got lost. David, we agreed we weren't going to—" "Just listen. I found some records in the county archives. That section of forest? It's been associated with disappearances going back to the 1800s. Miners, hunters, hikers. People go in and just don't come out. David. And the Paiute tribe that used to live in that area, they had a name for it. It translates roughly to the place where the earth is thin." I didn't want to hear any more, but David kept talking. "I think that clearing is some kind of gateway, a weak spot between our world and somewhere else, and I think those things we saw, they've been waiting there for a long time, hoping someone would be stupid enough to help them cross over." "We're not talking about this anymore," I said firmly. "We got lost in the woods. We were dehydrated and scared, and our minds played tricks on us. That's all. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mike, I still have dreams about them. Every night, they're still calling to me. I hung up and blocked his number. That was 6 months ago. I haven't spoken to David since, though I've heard through mutual friends that he's become obsessed with what he calls thin places, locations around the world where the supernatural supposedly bleeds through into reality. He's started a blog about it, posting grainy photos and rambling theories that make him sound increasingly unhinged. I've tried to put the whole experience behind me, to convince myself that it was just an unfortunate camping trip that got out of hand. Most of the time, I succeed. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I can swear I hear whispers coming from the darkness outside my bedroom window. Soft, persuasive voices that promise to show me wonderful things if I'll just step outside and listen. And sometimes, when I wake up in the morning, I find myself standing at the window, my hand on the latch, as if I've been trying to open it in my sleep. The doctors say it's a form of PTSD, a delayed reaction to the stress of being lost in the wilderness. They've given me medication that helps with the dreams, and therapy sessions where I talk about the experience in careful, clinical terms that drain all the terror from the memory. But I know the truth. Whatever we encountered in that clearing, it left something behind. A connection. A pathway that those things can use to reach across the distance between their world and ours. And I'm terrified that one night I'm going to stop fighting the urge to open that window. I'm terrified that one night I'm going to let them in. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Trinity Alps in Northern California, where the ancient pines grow so thick they swallow sound itself. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day backpacking trip with my 2 closest friends from college, Sarah Rodriguez and Amanda Wright. We'd planned this getaway for months, needing to escape the suffocating corporate world that had consumed our lives since graduation. The Trinity Alps wilderness seemed perfect, remote enough to disconnect from everything, beautiful enough to remind us why we used to love adventure. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, had researched every trail marker and elevation change. At 29, she approached everything with scientific precision, probably a side effect of her job as a lab technician. Amanda, 31, was our eternal optimist, the one who convinced us we needed this trip in the first place. She had this infectious laugh that could make you forget your troubles, at least temporarily. We'd chosen the Canyon Creek Trail, starting from the small town of Junction City. The plan was to hike 8 miles to Canyon Creek Lakes, set up base camp, then explore the surrounding peaks. What drew us specifically was the folklore Sarah had discovered, stories of Native American spirits that supposedly protected the lakes, and more recent tales of hikers reporting strange phenomena. Amanda thought it was romantic. Sarah was intrigued by the psychological aspects. I just wanted to get away from everything. The first day went perfectly. We reached the lower lake by late afternoon, the water so clear you could see granite boulders 20 feet down. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no cell towers, no human noise. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. We set up our 3-person tent on a flat granite shelf about 50 yards from the water's edge. The evening was magical. We cooked over our camp stove, sharing stories and laughing until our sides hurt. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply, typical for September in the high country. That's when we first noticed something odd about our fire. Amanda had built a perfect campfire ring, and we'd fed it steadily with dead pine branches. But around 10 o'clock, the flames began changing color, shifting from orange to an unsettling greenish blue. Sarah, being Sarah, immediately started theorizing about mineral deposits in the wood, causing chemical reactions. But the flames weren't just changing color, they were moving wrong, bending and twisting in ways that defied the gentle breeze. "That's weird," Amanda said, poking at the logs with a stick. The moment she touched them, the flames returned to normal orange. We laughed it off, blamed it on elevation and exhaustion. We should have paid attention. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on granite. Bare feet from the soft padding sound they made. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening, assuming one of my friends had gotten up for a bathroom break. But both Sarah and Amanda were breathing deeply beside me, clearly asleep. The footsteps circled our camp 3 times, always staying just at the edge of our firelight. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but some primal instinct kept me frozen. The sound was wrong somehow. Too light, too quick, with an odd rhythm like someone learning to walk. Finally, the footsteps faded toward the lake. I convinced myself it had been a deer or maybe a bear, though I'd never heard either make sounds like that. Morning brought relief and embarrassment. In daylight, with coffee brewing and pancakes on the camp stove, my midnight fears seemed ridiculous. Sarah mentioned hearing something during the night but couldn't be specific. Amanda had slept like the dead. We decided to explore the upper lake, about 2 miles further up the canyon. The trail was more challenging, requiring some scrambling over massive granite slabs, but the views were spectacular. Amanda kept stopping to take photos with her digital camera, documenting every wildflower and scenic vista. The upper lake was smaller but somehow more primordial. Steep granite walls rose directly from the water on 3 sides, creating an amphitheater effect. The 4th side where we approached had a small granite beach dotted with massive boulders. "It's like a cathedral," Amanda whispered, her voice echoing off the stone walls. We spent hours there, swimming in the shockingly cold water, sunbathing on warm granite, feeling completely disconnected from civilization. It was perfect. Too perfect. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sarah checked her GPS to make sure we had enough time to get back before dark. The device showed our location as somewhere in Nevada. "That's impossible," she muttered, turning the GPS off and on again. Same result. "We're supposedly 400 miles east of here." Amanda tried her phone's GPS. Same problem. We were apparently in the middle of the Nevada desert. My phone was completely dead, even though I'd charged it fully the night before. "Electronics glitch," Sarah said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "The granite probably has magnetic properties." We started back to camp, following the obvious trail we'd taken that morning. But after an hour of hiking, nothing looked familiar. The granite formations seemed different, oriented wrong. The stream we'd followed up was now on our right instead of our left. "We must have taken a wrong turn," Amanda said, but there hadn't been any turns. The trail had been straightforward. Another hour of hiking brought us to a lake. But not our lake. This one was larger, with dark water that reflected nothing. No granite beach, no familiar camping spots. And the silence here was different, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. "This is impossible," Sarah said, the first crack appearing in her rational facade. "We followed the same trail. We had to." Panic began creeping into our voices as we discussed options. We had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. Our camp, with food and warm clothes, was somewhere behind us. But where? Amanda suggested we make camp where we were and figure things out in the morning. Sarah wanted to keep moving, convinced we could find our way back if we just thought logically. I found myself caught between them, fighting the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. As we argued, the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. The temperature plummeted instantly, the way it does at altitude. Without our warm clothes or sleeping bags, we were in trouble. That's when we heard the laughter. It came from across the dark lake, high and musical, almost like wind chimes. But there was something underneath it, something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like someone laughing at a private joke, one we wouldn't find funny. "Hello," Amanda called out. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped instantly, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no water lapping, no night sounds at all. "We need to move," I said. "Now." But as we shouldered our day packs and prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Look at the water." The lake's surface, which had been mirror still, now showed ripples spreading outward from the center. But not random ripples, perfect concentric circles, as if something massive had surfaced and submerged without making a sound. We ran. I don't know how long we stumbled through the darkness, guided only by our small flashlights. The beam seemed weaker than it should have been, barely penetrating the blackness between the trees. Everything looked the same. Granite, pine trees, more granite, no landmarks, no familiar features. Finally, exhausted and shivering, we found a small clearing protected by a ring of large boulders. It wasn't much, but it offered some shelter from the wind that had started picking up. We huddled together, sharing body heat, trying to make our emergency supplies last. Sarah had a small emergency blanket in her day pack, Amanda had some energy bars, and I had a water bottle half full. Not much for 3 people facing a night in the wilderness without proper gear. "In the morning, we'll be able to see where we are," Sarah said, but her voice shook. "This will all make sense in the morning." The wind grew stronger, howling through the pines with a sound like voices. Not quite words, but close enough to make us strain to listen. Sometimes it almost sounded like it was calling our names. Around midnight, Amanda started crying. Not the normal tears of exhaustion and fear, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. "I can't feel my toes," she whispered. "I can't feel my feet." Sarah and I immediately began checking her for hypothermia, rubbing her extremities, sharing our meager warmth. But Amanda's skin felt normal, not cold at all, and when we asked her to wiggle her toes, she could do it just fine. "I can see them moving," she said, staring at her feet. "But I can't feel them. It's like they're not mine anymore." That's when Sarah screamed. She was looking past us into the darkness beyond our small circle of light. When we turned to follow her gaze, we saw them. Eyes. Dozens of pairs of eyes, reflecting our flashlight beams from the darkness between the trees. But they were wrong. Too large, too bright, and they didn't blink. They just watched us with an intelligence that made my throat close up with terror. "Bears," Sarah whispered, but she didn't believe it any more than we did. Bears' eyes didn't look like that. Bears moved. These eyes just watched. We sat frozen for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to look away, afraid to breathe too loudly. The eyes never moved closer, but they never left either. They formed a perfect circle around our small clearing, just at the edge of our light. Then Amanda started laughing. It started as a giggle, the kind that escapes when you're too scared to think straight. But it grew into something else, something that made Sarah and me exchange worried glances. Amanda was laughing like she'd heard the funniest joke in the world, like something was absolutely hilarious about our situation. "Amanda," I said carefully, "what's funny?" She turned to look at me, and in the flashlight beam, her eyes reflected the light just like the ones in the darkness. Not brown anymore, but silver bright and far too knowing. "Don't you see them?" she asked, still giggling. "They're beautiful. They want to play." "Amanda, there's nothing there," Sarah said, but her voice was hollow. We could all see the eyes. We could all see how they seemed to pulse with their own light now, not just reflecting ours. "They've been waiting so long," Amanda continued, and her voice was changing, becoming sing-song, like a child's nursery rhyme. Waiting for someone to find their special place. Waiting for someone to stay and play forever. She stood up, and both Sarah and I grabbed for her, but she moved with impossible grace, slipping through our desperate fingers like water. "Amanda, no!" Sarah screamed, but Amanda was already walking toward the circle of eyes. The moment she stepped beyond our light, the laughter started again. But now it was coming from Amanda's throat, mixing with the sound that drifted from the darkness. Two-part harmony that made my teeth ache. Sarah bolted upright, fumbling for her emergency whistle. The shrill blast cut through the night, and for a moment everything went silent. The eyes vanished. Amanda's laughter stopped, but Amanda didn't come back. "Amanda!" I called into the darkness. "Amanda, please!" Nothing. No response, no sound of footsteps, no indication that our friend was anywhere in the vast wilderness around us. Sarah and I pressed closer together, back to back, scanning the darkness with our failing flashlights. We called Amanda's name until our throats were raw, but the night swallowed our voices without echo. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the pine canopy. With visibility, our situation looked even worse. We were in a small clearing surrounded by unfamiliar granite formations. No sign of Amanda, no footprints, no indication anyone else had ever been there. "We have to find her," Sarah said, but she was shaking violently. Whether from cold or shock, I couldn't tell. We searched all morning, calling Amanda's name, looking for any sign of where she might have gone, but the ground was mostly solid granite, showing no tracks. And worse, we still had no idea where we were or how to get back to our camp. By noon, we were both showing signs of dehydration and exhaustion. Sarah's rational mind was fracturing under the stress. She kept checking her GPS obsessively, growing more agitated each time it showed us in impossible locations. Sometimes Nevada, sometimes Oregon, once it claimed we were in Alaska. "The map is wrong," she muttered, spreading our topographical map on a flat rock. "Everything is wrong. These peaks aren't where they should be. This lake shouldn't exist." Looking at the map with her, I realized she was right. According to our careful pre-trip planning, there was no large lake in this area. But we could see it through the trees, dark water stretching between granite walls. That afternoon, we heard Amanda calling for help. Her voice drifted through the forest, distant but unmistakably hers. "Jennifer! Sarah! Help me! I'm hurt!" We ran toward the sound, crashing through undergrowth, following her voice. But every time we got close, her calls seemed to come from a different direction. We ran in circles for an hour, always hearing her just ahead, just around the next rock formation, just through the next stand of trees. Finally exhausted, we stopped in a small meadow. Amanda's voice was all around us now, coming from every direction at once. "Help me," she called from our left. "I'm scared," came from our right. "Where are you?" echoed from behind us. "Don't leave me," whispered from directly above. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it bruised. "That's not Amanda," she whispered. The voices stopped instantly, as if they'd heard her. The silence that followed was complete and unnatural. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the sound of our own panicked breathing. Then the laughter started again, but this time it was definitely Amanda's laugh, coming from everywhere and nowhere and surrounding us like we were trapped inside a sound system. But underneath Amanda's familiar giggle was something else, a sound like breaking glass, like tearing metal, like screaming. We ran again, crashing blindly through the forest. Branches tore at our clothes and skin. Rocks turned our ankles. But behind us, the laughter followed, always just close enough to keep us moving. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing beside a small stream. The water was ice cold and tasted of minerals and something else, something metallic that coated our tongues. "We're going to die here," Sarah said matter-of-factly. Her scientific mind had processed our situation and reached the only logical conclusion. "No one knows exactly where we are. Our GPS doesn't work. We have no food, no shelter, no warm clothes. Even if someone starts looking for us, they'll never find us." I wanted to argue, to maintain hope, but looking around at the impossible landscape, I couldn't find words of comfort. We were lost in a place that didn't exist on any map, searching for a friend who might not be our friend anymore. As evening approached, we made our way to higher ground, hoping to see something familiar. What we saw instead made my blood freeze. In the distance, Maybe 2 miles away, we could see our camp, our bright orange tent, our carefully arranged gear, even smoke rising from our fire pit. It looked exactly as we'd left it 2 days ago. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. "We've been hiking for 2 days. We're miles from there." But there was no mistaking it. I could even see my red jacket hanging from the tree branch where I'd left it to dry. We started toward camp immediately, but with each step, it seemed to recede. What looked like 2 miles became 4, then 6. The sun set while we were still struggling through the forest, and in the darkness, we couldn't see our destination anymore. We spent another night huddled together, taking turns staying awake to watch for the eyes. They came back, forming their circle, watching and waiting. But this time, Amanda's voice joined them. "Come play," she called from the darkness. "Come play forever. It's beautiful here. You'll see." "Amanda, if that's really you, come into the light," I called back. "Show yourself." The voice giggled, that familiar sound now twisted into something that made my skin crawl. "Can't do that. Not allowed in the light anymore, but you can come to me. Come to the beautiful darkness." Sarah was rocking back and forth, humming tunelessly. The stress was breaking her mind, and I wasn't far behind. We'd been lost for 3 days now, with almost no food or water. Our bodies were failing, and our minds were following. On the 4th day, we found Amanda. She was sitting by the dark lake, the one that shouldn't exist, dangling her feet in the water. Her back was to us, but there was no mistaking her blonde hair, her familiar posture. "Amanda," I called, relief flooding through me. "Thank God, we've been looking everywhere." She turned to look at us, and I understood why she couldn't come into the light anymore. Her face was wrong. Not obviously wrong. All the features were there in the right places, but her skin had a gray pallor that suggested weeks underwater. Her eyes were the silver-bright color I'd seen in the darkness, and they didn't blink. Ever. And when she smiled, her teeth were too white, too sharp, and too numerous. "I've been waiting," she said, and her voice was Amanda's voice, but layered with something else, like an echo that arrived before the original sound. "I knew you'd find me eventually." Sarah made a choking sound and stumbled backward. I wanted to run too, but I couldn't stop staring at what used to be my friend. "The water is beautiful," Amanda continued, her silver eyes never leaving mine. "It shows you things. True things. Forever things." She gestured to the lake, and I saw that the dark surface was no longer empty. Shapes moved beneath the water. Pale, human-shaped forms with 2 long limbs and faces that shifted like smoke. "Come swim with us," Amanda said, and all the shapes in the water turned to look at us with their silver eyes. "Come play forever." That's when Sarah snapped. She screamed, a sound of pure terror and madness, and ran directly at Amanda. Maybe she thought she could save our friend, or maybe she just couldn't process what she was seeing. But as she reached Amanda, she didn't stop. She plunged directly into the dark water. The lake swallowed her without a splash. One moment she was there, screaming and desperate. The next, she was gone. The water's surface was mirror-smooth again, showing nothing. "Sarah will love it down there," Amanda said conversationally. "She'll learn so much. The water teaches you everything eventually." I backed away slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. Running hadn't worked before. The forest just brought us back here, to this impossible lake, to this thing wearing my friend's face. "I'm not going in the water," I said. Amanda tilted her head, studying me with those unblinking silver eyes. "No," she agreed. "You're different. You're the one who gets to leave." "What?" "Someone has to tell the story," she explained, standing up with fluid grace. Water dripped from her legs, but it ran upward instead of down, defying gravity as it returned to the lake. "Someone has to bring others back here. The beautiful darkness gets lonely." She walked toward me, and I saw that her feet weren't quite touching the ground. She moved like she was floating, or like the earth itself was afraid to support her weight. you'll go back to your world," she continued. "You'll tell people about the missing hikers, the beautiful lakes, the perfect camping spots, and some of them will come looking. Some of them will find us." "I won't," I said. "I won't bring anyone here." Amanda laughed, and this time the sound was pure joy, completely human, exactly the way she used to laugh when we were in college. For a moment, she looked exactly like my friend again. "Oh, Jennifer," she said fondly, "you don't have a choice. The story wants to be told. It has to be told. That's how it spreads." She reached out and touched my forehead with one gray finger. The contact was ice cold and burned like frostbite. Images flooded my mind. The real Trinity Alps, our actual campsite, the hiking trail that would lead me back to civilization. A map drawn in neural fire across my consciousness. "Go," she said, and her voice was fading, becoming distant. "Tell them about the beautiful lakes. Tell them about the perfect solitude. Tell them about the friends who found something wonderful." I found myself walking away from the lake, following a trail that definitely hadn't been there before. Behind me, Amanda's laughter faded into the whisper of wind through pine needles. The walk back to our real campsite took 6 hours. I found our tent exactly as we'd left it, our supplies untouched. According to my watch, which was working again, we'd been gone for less than 4 hours. Our hiking schedule, carefully planned by Sarah, showed we were supposed to return from our day hike around 4 p.m. It was 3:45. I packed everything with mechanical precision: tent, sleeping bags, cooking gear, everything that proved 3 women had come here together. I left nothing behind that might make searchers wonder about my missing friends. The hike back to the trailhead was uneventful. Normal forest sounds, normal GPS readings, normal everything. By evening, I was at the ranger station in Junction City, reporting that I'd completed a solo 3-day backpacking trip without incident. The lies came easily, too easily. I told anyone who asked that I'd decided to hike alone, that I'd had a wonderful time, that the Trinity Alps were absolutely beautiful and everyone should visit. I heard myself recommending specific trails, describing hidden lakes that would be perfect for adventurous hikers. Sarah and Amanda were never reported missing because, according to every record, they'd never existed. Our shared apartment had always been mine alone. Our college photos showed me with other friends, faces I didn't recognize, but that felt familiar. Their jobs, their families, their entire lives had been erased so completely that I began to doubt my own memories. But I still have Amanda's camera. It was in my backpack when I returned, though I don't remember putting it there. The photos show our entire trip, hiking, laughing, setting up camp, right up until the last picture. The final photo on the camera shows me sitting alone by our campfire, smiling at something off camera. The timestamp shows it was taken on our 3rd night, long after both my friends had disappeared. But in the photo, I'm not alone. There are shadows beside me, human-shaped but wrong, like people viewed through disturbed water. And if I look carefully at my own face in that photo, sometimes I can see that my eyes are the wrong color. Not brown like they should be, but silver bright and far too knowing. I keep the camera in a safety deposit box now, along with the topographical maps that show lakes that shouldn't exist. I tell myself I'll never look at them again, never be tempted to return to that place between places where the beautiful darkness waits. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself researching hiking trails, looking at forum posts from other solo hikers, planning trips to places I've never been, with detailed knowledge of campsites and water sources that I shouldn't possess. And I've started telling people about the Trinity Alps, how beautiful they are, how perfect for adventurous hikers looking for true solitude, how there are hidden lakes up there that most people never find. Some of them listen. Some of them ask for detailed directions, and some of them never come back. "The story wants to be told," Amanda said. "It has to be told." She was right. Even now, writing this down, I can feel the compulsion growing stronger, the need to share the perfect coordinates, the exact trail markers, the secret paths that lead to places between places. If you're reading this, if you're the kind of person who seeks out remote places and unmarked trails, then you're exactly the kind of person who would love the Trinity Alps. There are lakes up there that don't appear on any map, places where the water runs so deep and clear you can see forever. The hiking is challenging but rewarding. The solitude is absolute. And if you're very careful, very quiet, you might hear laughter echoing off the granite walls. Musical and joyful, like old friends calling you home. Just remember to bring a camera. The shadows up there are beautiful, and they love having their pictures taken. They're waiting for you. We're all waiting for you. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, near the abandoned mining town of French Gulch, California, where the ancient redwoods grow so thick they block out the sun even at midday. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus suggested we take the unmarked trail. My boyfriend of 3 years had always been the adventurous type, but there was something different in his eyes that morning, a restless hunger I'd never seen before. We'd been hiking the established trails around Castle Lake for 2 days, and I was content with the breathtaking views and peaceful solitude. But Marcus kept staring into the dense forest beyond the marked paths, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. "There's supposed to be an old mining settlement back there," he said, pointing toward a barely visible break in the tree line. "My coworker Jake told me about it. Said his grandfather used to work the claims up there in the 40s. I adjusted my backpack straps, already feeling the weight of our 3-day supply load. "Marcus, we planned this route for a reason. The ranger specifically said to stick to the marked trails in this area." "Come on, Jen. When's the last time we did something spontaneous?" His grin was infectious, the same one that had convinced me to quit my corporate job and move in with him 6 months ago. "It's just a detour. We'll be back on the main trail by evening." The smell hit me first as we pushed through the undergrowth, something sweet and cloying like fruit left too long in the sun. I pressed my bandana to my nose, but Marcus seemed oblivious, practically bouncing with excitement as he led us deeper into the forest. The trees here were different, their bark darker and somehow slick-looking, as if they were perpetually damp despite the dry autumn weather. After an hour of fighting through brambles and deadfall, we emerged into a clearing that made my skin crawl for reasons I couldn't articulate. The remnants of French Gulch were there, a few collapsed wooden structures, rusted mining equipment scattered like broken bones, and a single stone foundation that might have once been a general store. But it was the silence that unnerved me most. No bird songs, no insect buzz, not even the whisper of wind through the leaves. The air itself felt thick and expectant. "This is incredible," Marcus breathed, already setting down his pack and pulling out his camera. "Look at this place. It's like stepping back in time." I wanted to agree, but something was fundamentally wrong with the scene before us. The wooden structures, while obviously old, showed no signs of weathering. No moss, no rot, no insect damage. They looked like movie props, artificially aged but somehow pristine. And the mining equipment, though rusted, was arranged too neatly, as if someone had been maintaining the site's appearance. "Marcus, I don't like this. Something feels off." He was already exploring the largest structure, a 2-story building with gaping window frames that stared at us like empty eye sockets. "You worry too much. This is exactly the kind of place that makes for great photos. My hiking blog is going to love this." I stayed in the clearing, fighting the urge to bolt. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my eardrums like cotton. When I closed my eyes, I could swear I heard whispers at the very edge of perception. Not words, exactly, but something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. That's when I noticed the dolls. They hung from the trees at the clearing's edge, dozens of them, suspended by fishing line so thin it was nearly invisible. Old porcelain dolls with cracked faces and missing eyes, their mouths open in silent screams or grotesque smiles. They turned slowly in the absent breeze, and I realized with growing horror that they were all facing inward, toward the center of the clearing where Marcus and I stood. "Marcus," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, we need to leave. Now." But when I turned around, he was gone. The building he'd entered stood silent and empty, its doorway yawning like a mouth. I called his name again, louder this time, and my voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The dolls continued their slow rotation, their glassy eyes catching fragments of the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy. I approached the building with growing dread, each step feeling like I was walking underwater. The floorboards inside were surprisingly solid, barely creaking under my weight. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that slanted through the broken windows, but there was no sign of Marcus's passage. No footprints, no disturbed debris. "Marcus!" I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The echo came back wrong somehow, as if it had been filtered through something wet and organic. I climbed the rickety stairs to the second floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. Up there, the silence was even more complete, so absolute it felt like a living thing pressing against me from all sides. I found him in what might have once been a bedroom, standing perfectly still in front of a broken mirror, his back to me. "Jesus, Marcus, you scared me to death. I've been calling you." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. He stood motionless, staring into the fractured reflection, and I noticed with growing unease that his breathing seemed to have stopped entirely. No rise and fall of his shoulders, no misting of his breath in the surprisingly cold air. "Marcus!" I reached out to touch his shoulder, and the moment my fingers made contact, he spun around with inhuman speed. His face was exactly the same. Same brown eyes, same slightly crooked nose, same 5 o'clock shadow, but something fundamental had changed. His smile was too wide, stretching his mouth into an impossible crescent that showed too many teeth. And his eyes, while the right color, reflected no light at all, like looking into twin pools of black water. "I was just looking," he said, his voice perfectly normal except for a slight wet quality, as if he were speaking through a mouthful of saliva. "This place is fascinating, don't you think?" I stumbled backward, every instinct screaming at me to run. What were you looking at?" His head tilted at an angle that was just slightly wrong, like a bird studying a particularly interesting insect. "Myself. Want to see?" Before I could respond, he stepped aside and I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the broken mirror. I was there, pale and terrified, but where Marcus should have been was only empty space. The mirror showed me standing alone in the room, reaching out to touch nothing but air. I ran. I crashed down the stairs, through the building, and back into the clearing where the dolls continued their endless vigil. My rational mind tried to process what I'd seen. Mirror silvering can fail, creating blind spots, or maybe the angle was wrong. But my body knew better. Every cell was screaming at me to get as far away from this place as possible. I grabbed my backpack and started toward what I hoped was the way we'd come. But the forest had changed. The trees were different, their arrangement unfamiliar. The path we'd taken to reach the clearing had vanished entirely, replaced by an impenetrable wall of brambles and deadfall. I spun in a circle, trying to orient myself, but every direction looked the same. Dark, twisted trees stretching endlessly in all directions. "Jennifer." The voice came from behind me, and I knew without turning that it was Marcus, or the thing that looked like Marcus. The wet quality in his voice was more pronounced now, and underneath it was something else. A sound like static, or maybe the whisper of scales against stone. "Jennifer, where are you going? We haven't finished exploring." I forced myself to turn around. He stood at the edge of the clearing, still wearing that impossible smile, but now I could see that his skin had taken on a waxy quality, like melting plastic. His clothes hung differently too, as if the body underneath had changed shape. "Who are you?" I whispered. The thing that looked like Marcus laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with the death rattle of a dying animal. "I'm Marcus, of course, your loving boyfriend. Don't you recognize me?" As it spoke, its face began to shift subtly. The features remained the same, but the proportions were wrong, as if someone were adjusting the controls on an old television set. One eye sat slightly higher than the other, the nose twisted a few degrees to the right, the mouth stretched just a fraction too wide. "You're not Marcus," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Where is he? What did you do with him?" "I am Marcus," it insisted, taking a step toward me. With each movement, I caught glimpses of what lay beneath the facade, something that writhed and twisted, too many joints in all the wrong places. "I've always been Marcus. Don't you remember our first date? That little Italian restaurant on 5th Street? You wore the blue dress with the tiny flowers." The details were correct, which somehow made it worse. This thing had access to Marcus's memories, his thoughts, his knowledge of our relationship. But it wore them like an ill-fitting costume, everything slightly off, slightly wrong. I backed away, my hands fumbling for my phone. No signal, of course. The screen showed my GPS location as a blank gray void, as if I'd fallen off the edge of the world entirely. The compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Don't run, Jennifer," the Marcus thing said, its voice taking on a pleading quality that might have been convincing if not for the wet, sliding sounds that accompanied each word. "I have so much to show you. This place is full of wonders." It gestured to the clearing around us, and I realized with mounting horror that the dolls had moved. They were closer now, hanging lower, their painted faces turned toward me with expressions of malevolent joy. Some of them had begun to move their mouths, opening and closing in silent conversation, their cracked lips revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "The people who lived here," the thing continued, "they understood things that the outside world has forgotten. They knew how to cross between spaces, how to wear different skins, how to taste experiences through borrowed flesh." I couldn't help but look more closely at the dolls, and that's when I saw the truth that nearly sent me to my knees. They weren't dolls at all. They were people, dozens of them, shrunken and preserved, their skin turned to porcelain, their eyes replaced with glass marbles. Each one wore different clothes from different eras, as if they'd been collected over decades or centuries, and hanging among them, barely recognizable but unmistakably familiar, was Marcus. The real Marcus. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his mouth open in a scream that would never end. His hiking clothes hung in tatters, and I could see the puncture wounds in his neck where something had drained the life from him. "Do you like my collection?" the false Marcus asked, following my gaze. "I've been the caretaker here for so very long. Each visitor adds to the family. Each new face gives me new possibilities." I wanted to scream, to cry, to collapse with grief, but survival instinct overrode everything else. I turned and ran blindly into the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had killed my boyfriend calling my name in Marcus's voice, and underneath that, the sound of dozens of small feet running through the underbrush. The dolls were following me. I crashed through the forest like a wounded animal, no longer caring about direction or destination. My only thought was to get away from that clearing, from those watching eyes, from the thing that wore my boyfriend's face like a mask. Branches whipped across my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but the pain was almost welcome. It reminded me I was still alive, still myself. The forest seemed to shift around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing, the trees rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I would glimpse what looked like a trail through my peripheral vision, but when I turned toward it, there would be only more trees, more shadows, more places for things to hide. I finally collapsed against a massive redwood, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion. The silence here was different, not the oppressive, watching quiet of the clearing, but the natural hush of deep forest. I could hear my own breathing, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But safety was an illusion. As my breathing slowed and my heart stopped pounding quite so hard, I became aware of another sound, a soft humming, barely audible, coming from somewhere above me. I looked up slowly, dreading what I might see. There, perhaps 20 feet up the trunk of the redwood, Marcus clung to the bark like some impossible spider. But this wasn't the false Marcus from the clearing. This was something else entirely, something that had taken Marcus's basic shape but abandoned any pretense of humanity. Its limbs were too long, jointed in too many places, and it moved with a fluid, boneless grace that made my stomach churn. Its face was a rough approximation of Marcus's features, as if sculpted by someone working from a half-remembered description. "You run so beautifully," it said, its voice a wet whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Such graceful movements, such interesting patterns of fear." I pressed myself against the base of the tree, trapped between the thing above me and the dark forest that stretched in all directions. "What are you?" "I am what remains when the surface is peeled away," it replied, beginning to descend the tree with movements that were simultaneously fluid and jerky, like a marionette operated by a drunk puppeteer. "I am the hunger that lives in empty spaces, the need that cannot be filled. Your Marcus was delicious, but he was just the appetizer. He's dead, isn't he?" I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it said. Death is such a limited concept. He exists in me now, part of my collection, part of my understanding. I know his memories, his desires, his fears. I know how much he loved you, Jennifer. I know the sound you make when you sleep. I know the scar on your left shoulder from when you fell off your bike as a child. The thing reached the ground and began to circle me, always staying just at the edge of my vision. When I tried to look directly at it, it would flicker and shift, sometimes appearing human, sometimes revealing glimpses of what it really was, a writhing mass of darkness held together by stolen flesh and borrowed memories. "I can be him for you," it whispered, its voice becoming more recognizably Marcus's with each word. "I can wear his face, speak with his voice, touch you with his hands. You would never have to be alone." "You're not him," I said, though my voice shook with something more complex than fear. The offer was tempting in a way that horrified me. To have Marcus back, even a twisted version of him, even knowing what it really was. "But I could be," it insisted, and suddenly it was standing directly in front of me, wearing Marcus's face with perfect fidelity. "I could love you exactly the way he did. I could remember our anniversary, bring you coffee in bed, laugh at your terrible jokes. All you have to do is stop running." For a moment, looking into those familiar brown eyes, I almost believed it. The temptation was overwhelming. To give in, to accept this mockery of love, rather than face the reality of loss. But then I noticed the smell. Underneath the familiar scent of Marcus's cologne was something else, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "No," I whispered, and then louder, "No, you're not him. You'll never be him." The thing's face twisted with rage, the carefully maintained facade slipping to reveal something ancient and hungry underneath. "Then you can join him in my collection. You can hang in my garden and watch me wear his face for the next traveler who stumbles into my domain." It lunged at me with inhuman speed, but grief and terror had sharpened my reflexes. I rolled aside and the thing crashed into the tree where I'd been standing. For a moment, its borrowed flesh seemed to splash against the bark like water, revealing the writhing darkness underneath. Then it reformed, turning toward me with eyes that now glowed with their own sickly light. I ran again, but this time with purpose. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was forming. The thing fed on travelers, collected them in its clearing like trophies, But it had maintained that place for decades, maybe centuries. That meant it was territorial, bound to a specific location. If I could get far enough away, beyond its hunting ground, maybe I could escape. The forest seemed to fight me at every step. Roots rose up to trip me, branches reached out to snare my clothes, and the very ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. But I pressed on, driven by desperation and the fading hope that somewhere ahead lay safety. Behind me, I could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush, no longer bothering to maintain its human facade. The sounds it made were terrible, a combination of animal snarls, breaking branches, and something that might have been laughter if laughter could drive you insane just by hearing it. I burst through a wall of brambles and found myself standing at the edge of a cliff I didn't remember seeing on any map. Far below, a river wound through the canyon, and on the other side, I could see the blessed sight of a paved road with actual cars moving along it. Civilization, safety, a world where things like this didn't exist. But the cliff was at least 50 feet high, with no visible way down. "Nowhere left to run," the thing said behind me, its voice a harmony of Marcus's familiar tones and something that sounded like grinding glass. "Come back to me, Jennifer. Let me show you wonders." I turned to face it one last time. It had abandoned all pretense of humanity now, revealing itself as something that might have once been human, but had been twisted by centuries of feeding on travelers' pain and fear. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long and jointed in places where humans had no joints. Its face was a constantly shifting approximation of features it had stolen over the years. Now Marcus, now someone else, now something that had never been human at all. "I know what you are," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "You're a mimic, aren't you? You copy what you consume, but you can never really be them. You're just an echo, a shadow, a cheap imitation of life." The thing's face twisted with fury. "I am more than they ever were. I am eternal. I am—" I didn't let it finish. While it was distracted by its own rage, I pulled the emergency flare from my backpack and struck it against the rough bark of a nearby tree. It burst into brilliant red light, and the thing shrieked and recoiled as if I'd struck it with acid. "Light," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "You can't stand light." I held the flare high, and the thing retreated further, its stolen flesh beginning to smoke and bubble where the red glow touched it. But flares don't burn forever, and I could see this one already beginning to dim. That's when I heard the sound that saved my life, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. A search and rescue chopper was working its way up the canyon, probably looking for another group of lost hikers. I waved the flare frantically, hoping they would see the signal. The thing behind me realized what was happening and lunged forward despite the burning pain the light caused it. I felt claws rake across my back as I threw myself over the edge of the cliff, praying the river below was deep enough to break my fall. The last thing I saw before hitting the water was the thing standing at the cliff's edge, wearing Marcus's face one final time. But now I could see the truth beneath the mask. The writhing darkness, the ancient hunger, the hollow echo of something that had never truly been alive. I hit the river hard enough to drive all the air from my lungs, but the current was strong and it carried me away from that cursed place. The helicopter crew pulled me from the water 3 miles downstream, hypothermic and delirious, but alive. They never found Marcus's body, of course. The search team scoured the area for weeks, but they never found the clearing, never found the dolls, never found any trace of the mining settlement called French Gulch. The official report listed it as a hiking accident. One person presumed drowned, one survivor suffering from exposure and psychological trauma. But I know the truth. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I can still hear Marcus's voice calling my name. Not the thing that killed him, but the real Marcus, trapped somewhere in that creature's collection, aware but powerless, watching through stolen eyes as the mimic continues its endless hunt. I've moved 3 times since then, always to cities, always to places with lots of lights and people and noise. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even like to be alone after dark, because I know that somewhere in the remote wilderness of Northern California, in a clearing that exists only when it wants to be found, something that wears familiar faces is still collecting travelers. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is particularly dark, I swear I can smell that sweet, cloying scent of rot and old flowers, and I know it's still looking for me. The scar on my back where its claws raked across my skin has never properly healed. It throbs sometimes, especially on overcast days, as if something is still connected to me through those wounds, as if it marked me somehow, branded me as unfinished business. I tell myself I'm safe here in the city, surrounded by concrete and steel and electric light. But late at night, when I'm walking home from work or lying in bed listening to the sounds of traffic, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a familiar figure in my peripheral vision. Always just out of direct sight, always wearing Marcus's face, always watching and waiting. Because mimics are patient creatures, and some hunts can last a lifetime. The thing that haunts my nightmares isn't the monster itself. It's the moment of temptation when it offered to be Marcus for me, when I almost said yes. The horrible realization that grief can make you desperate enough to accept even the cruelest mockery of love, rather than face the reality of loss. I know now that there are worse things than being alone. There are things that wear the faces of the people you love, things that speak with their voices and remember their memories. But underneath all that stolen humanity is nothing but hunger and darkness and the endless need to consume. And somewhere in the wilderness of Northern California, among the hanging dolls and the too quiet trees, it's still waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into its domain, still adding to its collection, still learning new faces to wear. I should warn people, I know. I should tell my story to anyone who will listen, post warnings on hiking forums, contact the Park Service. But who would believe me? And how do you warn someone about a place that only exists when it wants to be found? All I can do is remember, and hope that my survival wasn't just luck. Hope that somewhere in that encounter I learned something that might help the next person who faces the thing that lives in the clearing where time stands still, and love is just another mask to be worn by something that has never known what it means to be human. Because the worst part isn't that Marcus is dead. It's that some part of him is still alive in that thing, trapped and aware, forced to watch as his face and voice are used to lure other victims to their doom. And until someone finds a way to destroy it completely, he'll never truly be at rest. That's the real horror of what I encountered in the Shasta Trinity Wilderness. Not just that monsters exist, but that they can take the faces of the people we love and make us accomplices in our own destruction through the simple, human need to not be alone. I am alone now, and I've learned to accept that loneliness is a small price to pay for remaining myself. Because in a world where things can steal your face and wear your memories like clothes, sometimes the only victory is refusing to let them take your identity too. The scars on my back are healing, slowly, but they serve as a constant reminder of what lurks in the wild places of the world. And every night, as I lock my doors and check my windows and make sure all the lights are burning bright, I whisper a promise to Marcus's memory that I will never forget, never give in, and never stop running if that thing ever finds me again. Because some hunts never end, and some monsters never stop wearing the faces of the people you love.